In the golden silence of ancient temples, where incense still whispers through time and shadows dance eternal upon stone walls, there lived a story that would echo through millennia. Here, beneath the endless azure of Egyptian skies, where the Nile flowed like liquid silver through the heart of the world, a child was born who would reshape the boundaries of empire and redefine the very meaning of power. This is not merely a tale of conquest, but a meditation on destiny itself, how greatness can slumber in the shadows, waiting patiently for its moment to emerge into the blazing light of history. In the quiet chambers of Memphis and Thebes, where scribes recorded the heartbeats of dynasties, the name Thutmose would be written in gold upon the scrolls of eternity. Yet the man who bore it began his journey in whispered uncertainty, learning the delicate art of patience while the world spun around him, unknowing of the storm that was gathering strength in the silence of his soul. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. In the year that would later be counted as 1481 before the Common Era, when the star Sirius rose once again to herald the flooding of the sacred Nile, a child entered the world whose destiny would be measured not in years but in the vastness of conquered lands. The birth took place within the walls of the great palace at Thebes, where the air itself seemed to hum with the weight of ancient power and the promise of things yet to come. The child was given the name Thutmose, meaning born of Thoth, the eye-besetted god of wisdom and writing, though the full weight of this name would not reveal itself for many years. His father, Thutmose II, ruled as Pharaoh of the two lands, but his reign was marked by the gentle weariness of a man whose strength had never quite matched his position. The young prince's mother was Isit, a woman of noble birth whose beauty was spoken of in whispers throughout the royal court, though she was not the great royal wife, but rather a secondary queen whose influence flowed through quieter channels. From his earliest days, the young Thutmose lived in a world that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight. His half-sister, Hatshepsut, daughter of the great Thutmose, the first and the powerful Queen Amos, cast a shadow that seemed to touch every corner of the palace. She was already a grown woman when he was born, married to their mutual father and bearing the full weight of royal expectation upon her shoulders. Where other children might have played with toys carved from wood and ivory, young Thutmose found himself navigating the subtle currents of palace politics before he could even properly hold a reed pen. The boy's earliest memories were painted in the golden light that filtered through the great columns of the palace halls, where he would watch the priests perform their daily rituals and observe the endless procession of nobles, scribes, and foreign ambassadors who came to pay homage to the divine Pharaoh. His father, weakened by illness that seemed to sap his strength like the desert sun draws moisture from green things, spent much of his time in consultation with physicians and priests, seeking remedies that never quite restored his vigor. It was during these formative years that young Thutmose first began to understand the delicate balance that governed Egyptian society. He learned to read not just the hieroglyphs that covered every surface of the palace, but the subtler language of glances, gestures, and silences that spoke volumes about the true nature of power. His tutors, chosen carefully by Hatshepsut herself, were among the most learned men in the kingdom, masters of mathematics, astronomy, theology, and the arts of war. The prince showed an early aptitude for learning that impressed even his most demanding instructors. He mastered the complex calculations required for architecture and engineering, understood the movements of the stars and their significance for the agricultural calendar, and demonstrated an almost intuitive grasp of military strategy that would later serve him well. Yet beneath this scholarly exterior, there burned a fire that those closest to him could sense, but not quite name, a restlessness that seemed to yearn for something beyond the confines of palace walls. As the years passed, it became increasingly clear that Thutmose II's health was failing. The pharaoh's face grew gaunt, his once commanding presence diminished by the slow ravages of illness. The royal physicians tried every remedy known to their arturbs from distant lands. Prayers to Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of healing, even the intercession of foreign gods, whose names were whispered in the darkness of the palace's most secret chambers. Nothing seemed to arrest the slow decline of the man who ruled the greatest empire the world had yet seen. During this period of uncertainty, young Thutmose found himself drawn increasingly to the company of the palace's military advisors. He would sit silently in the corners of council chambers, listening as grizzled veterans recounted tales of campaigns in Nubia and Syria, of fortresses taken by storm and enemies scattered like leaves before the wind. These men, weathered by years of service under the blazing sun of foreign lands, recognized something in the young prince that others had missed, a hunger for action that no amount of scholarly learning could satisfy. One of these advisors, a man named Amenemheb, who had served under the great Thutmose I, took particular interest in the prince's education. Amenemheb had witnessed the expansion of Egypt's borders under the previous pharaoh, had seen the terror in the eyes of foreign kings when they beheld the approach of Egyptian chariots. He understood that true leadership could not be learned from papyrus scrolls alone, but required the tempering fire of actual experience. Under Amenheb's guidance, Thutmose began to learn the practical arts of warfare. He studied the construction and maintenance of chariots, the forging of bronze weapons, the training of horses for battle. He learned to read the landscape like a scroll, understanding how rivers and hills could be used to strategic advantage, how the movement of enemy forces could be predicted and countered. Most importantly, he began to understand the psychology of leadership, how to inspire loyalty in subordinates, how to project confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet even as his military education progressed, the young prince remained acutely aware of his precarious position within the royal family. He was the designated heir, true enough, but he was still a child, while Hatshepsut possessed all the experience and authority of a fully fledged ruler. She had governed alongside her husband with skill and wisdom, earning the respect of nobles and priests alike. Her every word carried the weight of divine authority, while his voice had not yet broken from the high pitch of childhood. As Thutmose II's condition continued to deteriorate, the question of succession became more pressing with each passing season. The ancient traditions of Egypt were clear in their requirements. The pharaoh must be succeeded by a male heir, preferably the son of the great royal wife, though exceptions had been made in the past when circumstances demanded it. Young Thutmose, as the pharaoh's only surviving son, was the obvious choice, but his youth presented complications that could not be ignored. Hatshepsut watched these developments with the calculating eye of a woman who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics from her earliest youth. She had been born into power, raised to understand its requirements and responsibilities, and she possessed an intelligence that even her critics acknowledged. More importantly, she had earned the loyalty of key figures within the government and priesthood through years of competence, administration, and generous patronage of religious institutions. The solution that emerged from these complex circumstances was both ingenious and fraught with potential for future conflict. Following ancient precedent, it was decided that young Thutmose would indeed inherit the throne upon his father's death, but that Hatshepsut would serve as his co-regent until he reached maturity. This arrangement satisfied the legal requirements while ensuring that the government would continue to function under experienced leadership. The announcement of this decision was made during a great ceremony in the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, where the most powerful priests in the kingdom gathered to witness the formal designation of the succession. Young Thutmose, now about 7 years old, stood beside his stepmother as the high priest intoned the ancient formulas that would bind their destinies together. The boy's small hand rested on the golden scepter that symbolized royal authority, while Hatshepsut's fingers covered his own, a gesture that spoke volumes about the true nature of power in their relationship. To the assembled nobles and priests, the arrangement seemed both logical and necessary. Egypt required stable leadership, and Hatshepsut had proven herself capable of providing it. The young prince, for his part, would benefit from her guidance and experience, learning the art of kingship under the tutelage of one who had already mastered its complexities. Few could have predicted that this temporary arrangement would endure for more than 2 decades, or that it would shape the character of one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs in ways that would echo through the centuries. In the months that followed, as Thutmose II's health continued its inexorable decline, the palace began to adjust to the new reality. Hatshepsut gradually assumed more of the day-to-day responsibilities of government, while young Thutmose continued his education under the watchful eyes of his tutors. The transition was managed with such skill that many observers barely noticed the shift in power, a testament to Hatshepsut's political acumen and her understanding of the delicate balance required to maintain stability during a period of uncertainty. The young prince's routine during this period was carefully structured to prepare him for his future role. His days began before dawn with physical training, including running, swimming, and the martial arts that would serve him well in later military campaigns. After a light breakfast, he would spend hours with his scribes, learning to read and write, not only in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in the various foreign languages that would prove essential for diplomatic communications. The afternoon was typically devoted to more practical subjects: mathematics, astronomy, geography, and the complex religious and legal traditions that governed Egyptian society. Yet despite this intensive education, young Thutmose remained keenly aware that real power resided elsewhere. He observed how courtiers and officials deferred to Hatshepsut's judgment, how her word carried the final authority in matters great and small. He learned to read the subtle signs of political influence, understanding how decisions were made and implemented within the Byzantine structure of Egyptian government. This education in the realities of power would prove invaluable in later years, though at the time it must have been frustrating for a boy who bore the title of Pharaoh but wielded little actual authority. When Thutmose II finally succumbed to his long illness, the transition of power proceeded with the smooth efficiency that Hatshepsut had carefully orchestrated. The traditional 70-day period of mummification provided time for the necessary arrangements to be made, during which the co-regency that had been planned became reality. Young Thutmose, now bearing the full weight of the pharaoh's titles, stood beside his stepmother as they received the homage of Egypt's nobility and the submission of foreign ambassadors. The coronation ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theatre, designed to emphasize both the legitimacy of the new pharaoh and the necessity of Hatshepsut's continued involvement in government. The boy, Pharaoh, now about 9 years old, was presented with the traditional regalia of kingship, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the false beard of divinity, the crook and flail that symbolized his role as shepherd of his people. Yet even as he received these symbols of absolute authority, the careful observer would have noticed that Hatshepsut stood always at his side, her presence a constant reminder of where true power resided. In the years that followed, this arrangement settled into a pattern that would define the first half of Thutmose III's reign. Official documents bore both their names, with Hatshepsut's cartouche often appearing first, while artistic representations showed them as equals in divine majesty. The young pharaoh participated in religious ceremonies, received foreign dignitaries, and gradually assumed more responsibilities, yet always under the watchful guidance of his co-regent. For young Thutmose, these years were a time of intense learning and growing frustration. He possessed the intellect and natural ability to excel in his studies, mastering subjects that challenged even the most gifted of his contemporaries. His tutors reported that he showed particular aptitude for military strategy and engineering, subjects that would prove crucial in his later campaigns. Yet despite his growing competence, he remained essentially a student pharaoh, learning the theory of kingship while Hatshepsut managed its practical applications. The arrangement was not without its benefits for the young ruler. He had the luxury of observing statecraft from the inside without bearing the full burden of responsibility, learning from Hatshepsut's successes and mistakes without having to pay the price for his own inexperience. He watched as she navigated the complex relationships with provincial governors, managed the delicate balance between different religious factions, and maintained Egypt's international position through skilled diplomacy rather than military force. Hatshepsut reigned for, in practical terms, her reign was marked by unprecedented prosperity and monumental building projects. She ordered the construction of magnificent temples, including her own mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which would stand as one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world. Trade flourished under her rule, with Egyptian merchants venturing as far south as the mysterious land of Punt, returning with exotic goods that filled the royal treasuries and enhanced Egypt's reputation throughout the known world. Yet beneath the surface of this golden age, tensions were building that would eventually reshape the political landscape of the empire. Young Thutmose, now growing into adolescence, began to chafe at the restrictions of his position. His education had prepared him for active leadership, yet he remained largely a ceremonial figure, his authority circumscribed by the continuing presence of his stepmother. The military advisors who had helped shape his understanding of warfare spoke increasingly of the need for Egypt to reassert its dominance over its traditional vassal states, many of which had grown restless during the peaceful years of Hatshepsut's rule. The international situation was indeed changing in ways that would require a more aggressive response than Hatshepsut's diplomatic approach could provide. In the north, the kingdom of Mitanni had been expanding its influence among the city-states of Syria and Palestine, challenging Egypt's traditional hegemony in the region. Local rulers who had once paid tribute to the pharaoh now looked to Mitanni for protection and support, sensing that Egypt's military power had grown dormant during the long years of peace. These developments were not lost on young Thutmose, who spent increasing amounts of time in consultation with his military advisors. He studied maps of the empire's northern territories, learning the names of cities and rulers, understanding the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed international relations. He began to formulate plans for military campaigns that would restore Egypt's dominance, though for the moment these remained theoretical exercises rather than practical preparations. The tension between the two rulers was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to read the signs. Official inscriptions continued to praise their harmonious rule, but private conversations among court officials revealed a growing sense that the arrangement could not continue indefinitely. Young Thutmose was no longer a child who could be satisfied with the promise of future authority. He was becoming a man who felt the weight of his destiny pressing upon him with increasing urgency as the years of co-regency stretched on. Young Thutmose entered his teenage years with a growing sense of purpose and barely contained energy. His physical training had transformed him from a slight boy into a strong young man, capable of handling the heavy bronze weapons that Egyptian warriors carried into battle. His tutors in military science had given him a theoretical understanding of warfare that was both comprehensive and sophisticated. Yet he yearned for the practical experience that only actual combat could provide. The palace workshops became his second home during this period, as he spent countless hours learning the crafts that supported military operations. He studied with master armorers, understanding how bronze was forged and shaped into weapons that could pierce enemy shields and armor. He worked alongside chariot builders, learning the precise engineering required to create vehicles that could carry warriors swiftly across the battlefield while remaining stable enough for accurate archery. Most importantly, he spent time with the horse trainers, developing the skills that would make him one of the most accomplished charioteers of his generation, the young pharaohs. Education in leadership extended beyond military matters to encompass the broader skills required for effective governance. He learned to read the hieroglyphic scripts used for official documents, but also mastered the cursive hieratic writing that was used for everyday administration. He studied the complex legal codes that governed Egyptian society, understanding how justice was administered and how disputes were resolved. He learned the rituals and theological principles that underpinned the pharaoh's divine authority, memorizing the prayers and ceremonies that would legitimize his rule in the eyes of both gods and mortals. Yet perhaps the most valuable aspect of his education during this period was his growing understanding of human nature. Living in the shadow of Hatshepsut's authority, he learned to observe people carefully, to understand their motivations and predict their actions. He watched how different individuals responded to various forms of persuasion, how loyalty could be earned and maintained, how potential opponents could be neutralized through careful political maneuvering. These lessons in practical psychology would prove invaluable when he eventually assumed full authority and had to manage the complex personalities that populated his court. The young pharaoh's frustration with his limited role became increasingly apparent as he matured. He was now old enough to lead armies, old enough to make the crucial decisions that would shape Egypt's future, yet he remained constrained by the co-regency arrangement that had been established years earlier. His military advisors, many of whom had served under his grandfather, Thutmose I, spoke increasingly of the need for decisive action to restore Egypt's military reputation and reassert control over rebellious territories. Reports from the northern borders grew more troubling with each passing month. The kingdom of Mitanni had succeeded in creating a coalition of Syrian and Palestinian city-states that posed a direct challenge to Egyptian authority. Tribute payments that had once flowed steadily into the pharaoh's treasury had slowed to a trickle, while intelligence reports suggested that some former vassals were actively preparing for war. The situation demanded a military response, yet Hatshepsut remained committed to diplomatic solutions that seemed increasingly inadequate to the challenges at hand. It was during this period of mounting tension that young Thutmose began to assert himself more forcefully in government councils. His voice, now deep with the authority of approaching manhood, carried weight when he spoke of military matters. He presented detailed plans for campaigns that would restore Egyptian dominance, demonstrating a strategic insight that impressed even his most experienced advisors. His arguments were logical, his preparation thorough, and his confidence unmistakable. The relationship between the rulers during this period was complex and often strained. Hatshepsut had invested enormous effort in maintaining Egypt's prosperity and stability, and she was reluctant to risk these achievements through military adventures that might prove costly and destructive. She had witnessed the devastation that warfare could bring, had seen how military campaigns could drain the royal treasury and cost the lives of countless soldiers. Her preference for diplomatic solutions reflected not weakness, but a mature understanding of the true costs of war. Young Thutmose, on the other hand, represented a new generation that had grown up during the long peace and was eager to prove itself worthy of its illustrious ancestors. He had studied the military achievements of his grandfather, Thutmose I, had memorized the accounts of great victories that had extended Egypt's borders to their widest extent. He understood that military success was not merely about conquest, but about maintaining the respect and fear that kept the empire's enemies in check. Without the demonstration of force, he argued, Egypt's diplomatic initiatives would ultimately prove ineffective. The tension between these two approaches to governance would continue to build throughout the later years of the regency, setting the stage for the dramatic transformation that would occur when young Thutmose finally assumed sole authority, the boy who had learned patience in the shadow of greater power was slowly becoming the man who would revolutionize Egyptian military strategy and expand the empire to unprecedented dimensions. As the 20th year of Hatshepsut's reign approached, the political situation within Egypt and throughout the empire had reached a critical juncture. The long period of peace and prosperity had served the kingdom well, but new challenges were emerging that would require different solutions. The young Pharaoh, who had spent his formative years learning the arts of war and statecraft, was preparing to step forward and claim his birthright, though none could have predicted the magnitude of the transformation that would follow in the quiet hours before dawn. When the palace slept and the great river flowed silently through the heart of the empire, young Thutmose would stand on the palace balconies and gaze toward the northern horizon. There, beyond the green fields and desert wastes, lay the lands that had once acknowledged Egyptian supremacy but now dared to challenge the authority of the Pharaoh. The time was coming when words would no longer suffice, when the strength of Egypt's armies would once again be tested in the crucible of war. The boy who had learned to wait was becoming the man who would wait no longer. The transformation that was building within the regency would soon reshape not only Egypt, but the entire ancient world. The patient years of preparation, the careful study of military science, the gradual accumulation of political support, all of these elements were converging toward a moment of decision that would define the rest of Thutmose III's reign. The shadow years were drawing to a close, and the age of conquest was about to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the alabaster floors of Karnak temple as Thutmose III stood before the sacred bark of Amun-Ra, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of destiny finally settling upon his shoulders. 22 years had passed since he first wore the double crown as a child, yet only now, in the silence that followed Hatshepsut's death, did the full power of Egypt truly flow through his veins like the sacred waters of the Nile itself. The great hall echoed with the whispered prayers of high priests, their voices creating a symphony of devotion that seemed to bridge the mortal world with the realm of the gods. Incense smoke curled upward in delicate spirals, carrying with it the hopes and expectations of a kingdom that had known peace under his stepmother's rule, but now yearned for the glory that only a warrior Pharaoh could provide. In this moment of transition, as the last echoes of one reign faded into memory, Thutmose III felt the ancient spirits of his ancestors gathering around him, their presence as tangible as the cool morning air that drifted through the temples. Massive columns. His first act as sole ruler was not one of vengeance or dramatic proclamation, but rather a quiet pilgrimage to the tomb of his father, Thutmose II, whose brief reign had been overshadowed by the regency that followed. There, in the dim light of oil lamps that flickered like distant stars, the new pharaoh knelt beside the sarcophagus and spoke words that would never be recorded in stone or papyrus. A private conversation between father and son that transcended the boundaries of death itself. The weight of unfulfilled promises hung heavy in the air, and Thutmose III understood that his reign would not merely be about his own ambitions, but about completing the grand design that had been interrupted by political necessity and the complications of succession. When he emerged from the tomb, the transformation was visible to all who witnessed it. The uncertainty that had sometimes clouded his features during the years of shared rule had been replaced by a steely determination that reminded veteran courtiers of the great warrior pharaohs of old. His eyes, dark as the depths of the Nile, at flood time held a new intensity that spoke of plans already forming, of campaigns yet to be fought, and of an empire that would stretch far beyond the borders that Egypt had known for generations. The first challenge came not from external enemies, but from within the very heart of the kingdom. Hatshepsut's supporters, those who had grown comfortable with her peaceful reign and the prosperity it had brought, viewed the young pharaoh's obvious military ambitions with a mixture of anxiety and skepticism. They had witnessed 2 decades of successful trade, architectural achievements, and diplomatic stability. The great expedition to Punt had brought exotic goods and prestige without the cost in blood that military campaigns demanded. Why, they whispered in the shadowed corridors of the palace, should Egypt risk such prosperity for the uncertain rewards of conquest? Thutmose III understood their concerns, but he also possessed a vision that extended far beyond the comfortable boundaries of his inherited kingdom. He had studied the ancient texts, consulted with military advisors who remembered the glory days of his grandfather's reign, and spent countless hours in the temple archives, poring over maps and trade reports that revealed both the opportunities and the threats that lay beyond Egypt's borders. The Mitanni kingdom to the north was growing stronger, its influence spreading through the Levant like a slowly rising tide. The city-states of Syria and Palestine, once loyal tributaries, had begun to assert their independence, testing the resolve of their Egyptian overlords through increasingly bold acts of defiance. More concerning still were the reports from his network of spies and diplomatic envoys, men who moved like shadows through the courts of foreign kings and returned with information that painted a picture of a world in flux. The Hittite Empire, though still distant, was beginning to cast its influence southward, forging alliances and promising protection to those who would challenge Egyptian authority. Trade routes that had once flowed freely toward Egyptian ports were being diverted to competing kingdoms, threatening the economic foundation upon which Egypt's prosperity rested. In the cool hours before dawn, when the palace lay wrapped in the profound silence that comes only in the deepest part of the night, Thutmose III would often climb to the highest balcony of his private quarters and gaze northward toward the lands that called to him with an urgency he could not ignore. The stars above seemed to map out the territories that would one day acknowledge his supremacy. and in their cold light he could almost see the banners of his armies moving across distant landscapes, carrying the power of Egypt to the very edges of the known world. His first diplomatic initiatives were subtle but significant, messages sent to the courts of potential allies and enemies alike, each one carefully crafted to convey strength without immediately provoking conflict. To the loyal governors of Egyptian provinces, he sent reassurances of continued support and promises of greater rewards for faithful service. To the wavering city-states of the Levant, he offered final opportunities for peaceful submission, accompanied by carefully worded reminders of Egypt's military capabilities. To the distant powers who might consider themselves beyond Egyptian reach, he sent gifts that were simultaneously tributes to their current status and warnings of the attention they had attracted. The responses to these overtures arrived throughout the spring months, each messenger bringing news that added another piece to the complex puzzle of international relations that Thutmose III was methodically assembling. Some replies were encouraging, filled with flowery language and promises of continued friendship. Others were more troubling, their formal politeness barely concealing the defiance that lay beneath diplomatic courtesy. A few were openly hostile, their authors apparently convinced that the young pharaoh was too inexperienced or too cautious to respond to outright provocation. It was a message from the Prince of Kadesh, delivered by an arrogant ambassador who seemed to take pleasure in his insolent tone, that finally crystallized Thutmose III's resolve. The letter, written on papyrus of deliberately poor quality, suggested that Egypt's days of greatness were past, that the reign of a woman had made the kingdom soft, and that the true powers of the region need no longer concern themselves with Egyptian threats. The ambassador who delivered this insult compounded the offense by demanding audience with the pharaoh while wearing the colors of Kadesh rather than the white robes of diplomatic neutrality. The court held its breath as Thutmose III read the message, his face betraying nothing of the fire that burned within his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority that made even the most experienced courtiers straighten unconsciously in their seats. He thanked the ambassador for his message, praised the eloquence of his prince's words, and then, with a smile that never reached his eyes, announced that he would personally deliver Egypt's response to the gates of Kadesh before the next flood season began. The transformation that followed was as swift as it was comprehensive. The peaceful rhythms of Hatshepsut's reign gave way to the urgent preparations of a kingdom mobilizing for war. Armories that had been maintained but rarely used were suddenly bustling with activity as weaponsmiths worked day and night to produce the spears, swords, and arrows that would equip the pharaoh's armies. The great barracks of Memphis and Thebes, quiet for so long, now echoed with the sounds of training exercises as officers drilled, their men in the techniques of warfare that many had never experienced outside of ceremonial displays. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these preparations was the systematic way in which they were conducted. This was not the hasty mobilization of a young ruler eager to prove his courage, but rather the methodical preparation of a strategic mind that had spent years planning for this moment. Every detail was considered, from the supply chains that would keep the army fed and equipped during long campaigns, to the diplomatic communications that would maintain stability in Egypt's southern provinces while the pharaoh's attention was focused on northern conquest. The selection of commanders revealed the depth of Thutmose III's understanding of both military necessity and political reality. Veterans who had served under his grandfather were recalled to active duty, their experience invaluable in planning campaigns against enemies they had faced before. younger officers, products of the military academies that had continued to function, even during the peaceful years, were given opportunities to prove themselves in lesser commands, ensuring that the army would have capable leadership for years to come. Most importantly, the pharaoh made it clear that he would personally lead the expedition, a decision that sent shockwaves through both the Egyptian court and the foreign kingdoms that had grown accustomed to dealing with Egypt through diplomatic channels. The fortress of Megiddo rose from the Jezreel Valley like a stone crown upon the brow of the earth, its walls catching the first light of dawn in a display that spoke of both beauty and defiance. From his position on the ridge overlooking the valley, Thutmose III studied the stronghold that had become the symbol of resistance to Egyptian authority, its towers and battlements representing not just military challenge, but the test of his own transformation from protected prince to warrior pharaoh. The march north from Egypt had been a revelation in itself, a journey that transformed both the pharaoh and his army with each mile that passed beneath their feet. The great column that had departed from Memphis, 20,000 infantry, 1,500 chariots, and countless support personnel, had moved through the landscape like a river of bronze and leather, their passage marked by the dust clouds that rose to meet the desert sky and the rhythmic sound of marching feet that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the kingdom itself at Gaza. The first major waypoint on their journey, Thutmose III had paused to receive the submission of local governors, and to address the concerns of Egyptian administrators who had grown nervous about the security of their positions. The meetings had been conducted in the great hall of the fortress, where maps covered every available surface and scribes worked continuously to document the intelligence that flowed in from scouts and spies scattered throughout the region. Here, in the practical details of campaign planning, the pharaoh's administrative genius first revealed itself in its full complexity, unlike the warrior pharaohs of legend, who were remembered primarily for their courage in battle and their ability to inspire troops through personal example. Thutmose III approached warfare with the systematic precision of a master craftsman. Every aspect of the campaign was planned and documented, from the exact quantities of grain and water required to sustain the army during siege operations, to the diplomatic protocols that would govern the treatment of defeated enemies and the integration of conquered territories into the Egyptian administrative system. The intelligence network that supported these preparations was perhaps the most sophisticated that the ancient world had ever seen. Merchants who had traded throughout the Levant for decades found themselves recruited as sources of information about fortress defenses, local politics, and the movements of enemy forces. Egyptian officials who had served in the region during previous administrations were interviewed extensively, their memories of local customs and personalities proving invaluable in planning not just military operations but the peace that would follow victory as the army moved north from Gaza toward the inevitable confrontation at Megiddo. Thutmose III took every opportunity to observe his troops and their commanders, noting strengths and weaknesses that would influence his tactical decisions in the battles to come. The chariot corps, pride of the Egyptian military, demonstrated the precision and coordination that came from years of training, their formations flowing across the landscape like schools of fish moving through clear water. The infantry, though less glamorous than the charioteers, showed the steady discipline that would be crucial during the long siege operations that lay ahead. But it was in the evening hours, when the army had made camp and the immediate demands of march and logistics had been satisfied, that Thutmose III revealed another dimension of his emerging leadership style. Unlike pharaohs who maintained their distance from common soldiers, he moved freely through the camps, speaking with officers and men alike, learning their names and their concerns, and gradually building the personal relationships that would transform a collection of military units into a unified force devoted to his vision of Egyptian greatness. The stories that emerged from these informal encounters spread throughout the army like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Soldiers spoke of a pharaoh who remembered their names from one conversation to the next, who asked about their families and their hopes for the future, and who seemed to understand both the fears and the ambitions that drove men to follow their king into the uncertainty of battle. Officers found themselves consulting with a ruler who not only understood the theoretical principles of warfare, but who had clearly given deep thought to the practical challenges of command and the psychological factors that would determine victory or defeat. The final approach to Megiddo required a decision that would test both the pharaoh's strategic judgment and his ability to inspire confidence in his commanders. The traditional route to the fortress led through the Aruna Pass, a narrow defile that would force the Egyptian army to march in single file for several miles, vulnerable to attack from enemies positioned on the heights above. Military convention suggested taking one of the longer but safer routes that would allow the army to maintain formation while approaching their objective. In the great tactical conference that preceded this crucial decision, Thutmose III listened carefully to the arguments presented by his senior commanders. The veterans favored caution, their experience teaching them that battles were more often lost through unnecessary risks than won through bold gestures. The younger officers, eager to prove themselves and confident in their pharaoh's leadership, argued for the direct approach, claiming that the psychological impact of an unexpected arrival through the supposedly impassable pass would demoralize the enemy and potentially avoid a prolonged siege. The debate continued through the night, with maps and tactical diagrams spread across tables, illuminated by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls of the command tent. Messengers arrived regularly with updates from the scouting parties that had been observing the enemy positions, their reports adding new dimensions to the complex calculations that would determine the fate of the campaign. As dawn approached, the weight of decisions seemed to press down upon the conference like the heavy air that precedes a thunderstorm. When Thutmose III finally spoke, his words carried the quiet authority of a ruler who had considered every aspect of the problem and reached a conclusion that balanced risk against opportunity with mathematical precision. The army would take the direct route through the Aruna Pass, but the movement would be executed with careful attention to the security, measures that would minimize their vulnerability during the dangerous passage. Advance parties would secure the heights on both sides of the pass. Diversionary forces would create the impression of movement along the alternative routes, and the main body would move through the defile in carefully coordinated stages that would allow for rapid deployment. Once they reached the valley beyond, the passage through the Aruna Pass became the stuff of legend even as it was happening. A military operation that combined audacity with meticulous planning in a way that would influence tactical thinking for generations to come. As the great column of chariots and infantry wound its way through the narrow canyon, the very rocks seemed to echo with the sound of bronze weapons and leather armor, while above them Egyptian scouts maintained watch from positions that had been thought impregnable by their enemies. The psychological impact of the Egyptian army's sudden appearance in the Jezreel Valley was everything that the young officers had predicted and more. The coalition forces that had gathered at Megiddo, confident in their defensive position and secure in the knowledge that any Egyptian approach would be visible from miles away, found themselves facing an enemy that had materialized as if summoned by the gods themselves. The careful coordination of their defensive plans dissolved in the face of this unexpected development, and what had been intended as a coordinated resistance became a series of improvised responses to a situation that no one had anticipated. Thutmose's positioning of his forces for the battle that would follow demonstrated the same combination of strategic insight and tactical flexibility that had characterized the entire campaign. Rather than launching an immediate assault that would have played to the defenders' strengths, he deployed his army in a formation that offered multiple options while maintaining the initiative that had been gained through the unexpected approach. The chariot corps took position on the flanks, where their mobility could be used to exploit any weakness in the enemy line, while the infantry formed up in the center, their disciplined ranks presenting a picture of implacable determination that was visible from the walls of Megiddo itself. The battle, when it finally came, was decided not by superior numbers or individual heroism, but by the systematic application of tactical principles that had been refined through years of study and preparation. The Egyptian attack unfolded like a mathematical equation, each phase building upon the results of the previous one, until the coalition forces found themselves overwhelmed not by savage fury but by the relentless precision of an army that fought as a single organism guided by a supremely capable intelligence. The siege of Megiddo that followed the battlefield victory revealed yet another dimension of Thutmose III's comprehensive approach to warfare. Rather than attempting to storm the fortress walls in costly frontal assaults, he implemented a blockade that gradually strangled the defenders' ability to resist while minimizing Egyptian casualties. The siege works that surrounded the fortress were engineering marvels in their own right, a complex system of trenches, walls, and towers that effectively created a second city whose sole purpose was to ensure that nothing entered or left Megiddo without Egyptian permission during the long months of the siege. The Pharaoh's attention was divided between the immediate tactical requirements of maintaining the blockade and the broader strategic implications of his victory. Messages flowed constantly between the siege lines and the administrative centers of Egypt, carrying detailed reports of the campaign's progress and instructions for the governance of territories that had already submitted to Egyptian authority. The bureaucratic machinery that would transform military conquest into lasting imperial control was already taking shape even as the siege continued. The final surrender of Megiddo came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet acknowledgement of practical reality. The defenders, reduced to eating leather and drinking water from contaminated wells, sent envoys to negotiate terms that would preserve some measure of dignity, while acknowledging the complete transformation of the political landscape. Thutmose III received these emissaries with the courtesy due to brave enemies. But his terms were non-negotiable: complete submission to Egyptian authority, tribute payments that would ensure future loyalty, and the surrender of hostages who would guarantee the good behavior of the former coalition members. The wealth that flowed into Egyptian hands following the fall of Megiddo was staggering in its magnitude and diversity. Gold and silver, precious stones and exotic spices, fine textiles and masterwork, weapons all found their way into the tribute trains that began the long journey back to Egypt. But perhaps more valuable than these material treasures was the psychological impact of the victory on both Egyptian morale and international perception. The kingdom that had been dismissed as weakened by a woman's peaceful reign had demonstrated that it possessed not only the military strength to project power far beyond its borders, but also the organizational sophistication necessary to sustain such efforts over time. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace of Thebes lay wrapped in the profound silence that comes only in the deepest part of the night, Thutmose III would often be found in his private study, surrounded by maps and documents that represented the growing complexity of his expanding empire. The flickering light of oil lamps cast dancing shadows across papyrus scrolls, covered with the careful notations of scribes who worked tirelessly to document the transformation of Egypt from a regional power into the master of the known world. The victory at Megiddo had been more than a military triumph. It had been a revelation that changed the fundamental nature of Egyptian statecraft and administration. The traditional model of pharaonic rule, based on the direct governance of the Nile Valley and the collection of tribute from nearby territories, was proving inadequate for the management of an empire that now stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates River. New systems had to be created, new relationships established, and new balances struck between the demands of local autonomy and imperial unity. The first challenge was purely practical: how to maintain communication across distances that would have been unimaginable to earlier pharaohs. The solution that emerged from the combined efforts of the royal scribes and the military logistics corps was a relay system of unprecedented sophistication, with way stations positioned at regular intervals along the major routes connecting Egypt to its most distant provinces. These stations, fortified and well supplied, served multiple functions as communication hubs, supply depots, and symbols of Egyptian authority that made the pharaoh's presence felt even in the remotest corners of his domain. Each station was staffed by a carefully selected team of officials whose responsibilities extended far beyond the simple relay of messages. They served as local intelligence gatherers, reporting on everything from weather conditions and crop yields to the political sentiments of nearby populations and the activities of potential enemies. They maintained detailed records of trade flows, monitoring the movement of goods and people in ways that allowed the central administration to track economic trends and identify potential problems before they became crises. The information that flowed through this network transformed the nature of royal decision-making in ways that would have profound implications for the future of Egyptian civilization. For the first time in history, a pharaoh could base his policies on comprehensive, up-to-date information about conditions throughout his realm, rather than relying on the necessarily limited perspectives of local governors or the potentially biased reports of interested parties. This new level of administrative sophistication allowed for the development of policies that were both more responsive to local needs and more effective in achieving imperial objectives. The tribute system that emerged from this enhanced information network was a masterpiece of administrative engineering that balanced the competing demands of imperial revenue, local prosperity, and political stability, rather than imposing uniform requirements across all conquered territories. Thutmose III developed a flexible system that took into account the specific resources and capabilities of each region. Territories rich in gold paid their tribute in precious metals, while those blessed with fertile soil contributed grain and other agricultural products. Regions known for their skilled craftsmen sent finished goods, while those positioned along important trade routes paid in the form of commercial taxes and fees. This differentiated approach to tribute collection had the effect of encouraging economic specialization and development rather than simply extracting wealth from conquered territories. Local rulers found that they could increase their own prosperity by focusing on their region's comparative advantages, knowing that their tribute obligations would be adjusted accordingly. The result was a level of economic integration that transformed the Egyptian empire from a collection of conquered territories into a coherent economic unit that benefited all its participants. The cultural implications of this administrative revolution were equally profound. As Egyptian officials moved throughout the empire, they brought with them not only the pharaoh's authority but also Egyptian ideas about law, religion, and social organization. At the same time, they were exposed to local customs and practices that gradually influenced their own thinking and behavior. The result was a gradual synthesis of Egyptian and foreign elements that created a distinctive imperial culture that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely foreign, but something entirely new. This cultural fusion was most visible in the realm of religion, where Egyptian gods were gradually identified with local deities, creating new forms of worship that honored both traditions while serving the practical purpose of reinforcing imperial unity. The great temple complexes that Thutmose III built throughout his empire were designed not only as places of worship, but as symbols of the harmonious relationship between Egyptian authority and local traditions. Their architecture incorporated elements from both cultures, creating structures that were immediately recognizable as Egyptian, while remaining respectful of local architectural preferences. The legal system that governed this diverse empire represented another triumph of administrative innovation. Rather than imposing Egyptian law uniformly across all territories, the pharaoh's legal advisors developed a hierarchical system that allowed for local variations in minor matters while maintaining imperial authority over major crimes and disputes. Local courts continued to function according to traditional practices, but their decisions could be appealed to Egyptian administrators who applied imperial law in cases that affected the broader interests of the empire. This legal pluralism served multiple purposes beyond simple administrative efficiency. It demonstrated respect for local traditions and customs, thereby reducing the likelihood of rebellion based on cultural grievances. It provided a mechanism for the gradual introduction of Egyptian legal concepts without creating the disruption that would have resulted from sudden, comprehensive legal reform, and it created a class of local legal professionals who had reasons to support the imperial system because it provided them with opportunities for advancement and increased influence. The military implications of empire were equally complex and stretching. The traditional Egyptian army, organized around the defense of the Nile Valley and the projection of power into immediately adjacent territories, had to be transformed into a force capable of maintaining order across vast distances and diverse populations. This transformation required not only changes in military organization and tactics, but also fundamental rethinking of the relationship between the army and the state. The solution that emerged, REFLECTED, Thutmose III's genius for balancing competing demands and creating systems that served multiple purposes simultaneously, rather than maintaining a single, centralized army that would have been prohibitively expensive and logistically impossible to deploy effectively. He created a network of regional forces that combined Egyptian troops with local auxiliaries under the command of Egyptian officers. These mixed units served as both military forces and instruments of cultural integration, bringing together soldiers from different backgrounds under the common banner of Egyptian imperial service. The training and organization of these imperial forces reflected the same attention to detail and systematic thinking that characterized all aspects of Thutmose III's administration. Standard procedures were developed for everything from weapons, maintenance, and tactical formations to the treatment of prisoners and the distribution of plunder. These procedures were documented in military manuals that were distributed throughout the empire, ensuring that Egyptian military practices were consistently applied regardless of the specific composition of individual units. The economic benefits of this military system extended far beyond simple defense considerations. The presence of Egyptian troops in local communities created markets for goods and services that stimulated economic activity and encouraged the development of local industries. The construction and maintenance of military installations provided employment for skilled workers and artisans, while the movement of troops and supplies created opportunities for merchants and transporters. The result was a military establishment that contributed to imperial prosperity rather than simply consuming imperial resources. The diplomatic dimension of empire management proved to be equally sophisticated and far-reaching in its implications. The traditional Egyptian approach to foreign relations, based on the assumption of pharaonic supremacy and the expectation of tribute from lesser powers, had to be adapted to deal with a world in which Egypt was now in direct contact with major powers like the Hittite Empire and the Kingdom of Mitanni. These relationships required a level of diplomatic sophistication that went far beyond the ceremonial exchanges that had characterized Egyptian foreign policy in earlier periods. The diplomatic service that developed under Thutmose III's direction represented a new kind of professional expertise that combined traditional Egyptian administrative skills with specialized knowledge of foreign languages, customs, and political systems. Egyptian ambassadors were expected to function not only as representatives of pharaonic authority, but as skilled negotiators, capable of protecting Egyptian interests while maintaining the relationships necessary for continued imperial prosperity. They were supported by extensive intelligence networks that provided detailed information about the internal politics and economic conditions of foreign kingdoms, allowing them to time their initiatives and frame their proposals in ways that maximized their chances of success. The correspondence that flowed between the Egyptian court and foreign capitals during this period reveals the remarkable sophistication of these diplomatic operations. Messages were crafted with careful attention to the psychological and cultural factors that would influence their reception, while the gifts that accompanied them were selected to demonstrate both Egyptian wealth and Egyptian understanding of the recipient's preferences and values. The result was a diplomatic system that was both more effective and more respectful of foreign sensibilities than anything that had existed in the ancient world up to that time. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this administrative revolution was the way in which it transformed the pharaoh's own role and responsibilities. Traditional pharaonic authority had been based on the ruler's direct participation in religious ceremonies, military campaigns, and judicial proceedings. The scale and complexity of the new empire made such direct involvement impossible, requiring the development of new forms of delegated authority that maintained the essential character of pharaonic rule while allowing for the efficient management of vast territories and diverse populations. The solution that emerged was a system of graduated authority that extended the pharaoh's power through a carefully constructed hierarchy of officials, each of whom exercised specific aspects of royal authority within defined geographical or functional limits. These officials were bound to the pharaoh through personal oaths of loyalty and through practical arrangements that made their own prosperity dependent on the successful execution of imperial policies. The result was a government that was both more centralized and more flexible than anything that had existed before, capable of responding quickly to local crises while maintaining the unity and coherence that imperial rule required. The great hypo-style hall of Karnak Temple rose toward the heavens like a forest of stone, its massive columns carved with the records of Thutmose III's triumphs and decorated with scenes that would preserve his glory for all eternity. In the cool shadows between these monuments to imperial achievement, The pharaoh moved with the quiet confidence of a ruler who had transformed not only the boundaries of his kingdom, but the very nature of Egyptian civilization itself. The years following the victory at Megiddo had brought a succession of campaigns that extended Egyptian authority deeper into the Levant and established the empire's northern frontier along the banks of the Euphrates River. Each expedition had been carefully planned and methodically executed, with the lessons learned from earlier campaigns incorporated into increasingly sophisticated military and administrative procedures. The result was a series of victories that seemed almost inevitable in their systematic progression, each one building upon the foundations laid by its predecessors. The second major campaign, launched 3 years after Megiddo, had targeted the coastal cities of Phoenicia, whose strategic importance lay not only in their wealth and population, but in their control of maritime trade routes that connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world. The siege of Tyre, conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized the reduction of Megiddo, had demonstrated the maturation of Egyptian siege warfare techniques and the growing sophistication of the imperial military machine. The naval dimension of this campaign had represented a significant departure from traditional Egyptian military practice. The pharaoh's decision to construct a fleet capable of supporting amphibious operations had required the development of new technologies and the recruitment of skilled sailors and navigators from throughout the empire. The successful coordination of land and sea forces during the Phoenician campaign had established Egypt as a major naval power and opened new possibilities for the projection of Egyptian influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The wealth that flowed into Egyptian treasuries from these successive campaigns was staggering in its magnitude and transformative in its effects. Gold from Nubian mines, silver from Anatolian deposits, cedar wood from Lebanese forests, and exotic goods from the far reaches of the known world all found their way into the tribute trains that wound their way south toward the temples and palaces of Egypt. But perhaps more important than the material wealth was the psychological impact of these treasures on both Egyptian society and international perception. The transformation of Egyptian architecture and art during this period reflected the profound changes that imperial success had brought to the kingdom's cultural life. The temples and palaces that rose during Thutmose III's reign were not merely larger and more elaborate than their predecessors. They represented a new aesthetic vision that incorporated elements from throughout the empire, while maintaining the essential character of Egyptian artistic tradition. The fusion of Egyptian and foreign motifs created works of art that were both familiar and exotic, reflecting the cosmopolitan character of the new imperial culture. The great temple complex at Karnak, already ancient when Thutmose III came to power, was transformed during his reign into a monument that reflected the global reach of Egyptian authority. The festival hall that he constructed there incorporated architectural elements from throughout the empire, while the walls were decorated with botanical and zoological specimens from the far corners of the known world. The message was clear. Egypt had become not just a regional power, but the center of a civilized world that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Nile Valley. The religious implications of imperial expansion were equally profound and far-reaching. The traditional Egyptian pantheon, with its emphasis on the gods of the Nile and the desert, had to be expanded to accommodate the deities and religious practices of conquered territories. This process of religious syncretism was managed with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all aspects of imperial administration, creating new forms of worship that honored both Egyptian traditions and local practices, while reinforcing the ideological foundations of imperial rule. The identification of Amun-Ra with the sun gods of other cultures served multiple purposes beyond simple religious accommodation. It provided a theological foundation for the pharaoh's authority over diverse populations, demonstrating that the same divine power that had traditionally legitimized Egyptian rule was recognized and worshipped throughout the empire. It created opportunities for the integration of local religious elites into the imperial administrative structure, providing them with incentives to support Egyptian rule while maintaining their own cultural identities. The economic transformation of Egypt during this period was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the imperial revolution. The traditional Egyptian economy, based on agriculture along the Nile and limited trade with immediately adjacent territories, was transformed into a complex system that integrated production and exchange across vast distances and diverse economic systems. The result was a level of prosperity that affected every aspect of Egyptian society, from the great nobles who managed imperial territories to the common farmers whose grain fed the armies that maintained Egyptian authority. The development of new trade routes and commercial relationships had effects that extended far beyond simple economic considerations. Egyptian merchants, protected by imperial military power and supported by imperial diplomatic networks, established trading posts and commercial relationships throughout the known world. These commercial connections served as channels for the exchange of ideas and technologies as well as goods, contributing to a level of cultural interaction that was unprecedented in the ancient world. The administrative challenges of managing this complex economic system required the development of new forms of record-keeping and financial control that represented major advances in governmental technique. The scribal schools that had traditionally focused on the production of religious texts and simple administrative records were transformed into sophisticated institutions that trained specialists in international law, foreign languages, and complex financial procedures. The result was a professional bureaucracy that was both more capable and more specialized than anything that had existed in the ancient world up to that time. The social implications of imperial success were equally transformative. The traditional Egyptian social hierarchy, with its clear distinctions between nobles, priests, craftsmen, and farmers, was complicated by the addition of new categories of imperial administrators, military officers, and commercial specialists. The opportunities for social advancement that empire provided created new forms of social mobility, while maintaining the essential stability that Egyptian society required. The integration of foreign populations into Egyptian society, whether as slaves, craftsmen, or administrators, brought new perspectives and capabilities that enriched Egyptian culture while presenting challenges that required careful management. The pharaoh's policies toward foreign populations reflected the same balanced approach that characterized all aspects of imperial administration, providing opportunities for advancement and integration while maintaining the security and stability that imperial rule required. The military reforms that accompanied imperial expansion represented a fundamental transformation of Egyptian military organization and doctrine. The traditional Egyptian army, organized around the defense of the Nile Valley and the projection of power into immediately adjacent territories, was transformed into a professional force capable of sustained operations across vast distances and diverse terrains. This transformation required not only changes in military organization and tactics, but also fundamental rethinking of the relationship between the army and the state. The creation of professional military schools and training institutions represented a major innovation in Egyptian military practice. These institutions, staffed by veterans of the imperial campaigns and foreign specialists recruited from throughout the empire, provided systematic training in the arts of war that went far beyond the traditional Egyptian emphasis on individual courage and royal leadership. The result was a military establishment that was both more effective and more reliable than anything that had existed in the ancient world up to that time. The technological innovations that emerged from the imperial campaigns had effects that extended far beyond military applications. The development of new siege engines and fortification techniques, driven by the practical requirements of imperial warfare, led to advances in engineering and construction that transformed Egyptian architecture and public works. The creation of new navigational instruments and shipbuilding techniques, necessitated by the expansion of Egyptian naval power, contributed to advances in maritime technology that benefited commercial as well as military activities. The diplomatic achievements of the imperial period represented, perhaps, the most sophisticated aspect of Thutmose III's statecraft. The network of alliances and treaty relationships that he constructed served multiple purposes beyond simple military cooperation, creating a web of political and economic relationships that reinforced Egyptian authority while providing benefits to all participants. The marriage alliances that connected the Egyptian royal family to ruling dynasties throughout the empire created personal relationships that complemented formal diplomatic arrangements, ensuring that imperial policies were supported by personal loyalty as well as political calculation. The cultural exchange that resulted from these diplomatic relationships had profound effects on Egyptian intellectual and artistic life. The scholars and artists who moved between the courts of the empire brought with them new ideas and techniques that enriched Egyptian culture while spreading Egyptian influence throughout the known world. The libraries and schools that were established in major imperial centers served as focal points for this cultural exchange, creating institutions that would preserve and transmit the achievements of the imperial period to future generations. As the sun set over the waters of the Nile, casting long shadows across the monuments that recorded his achievements, Thutmose III could look back on a transformation that had exceeded even his most ambitious dreams. The Egypt that he had inherited, already ancient and proud, had become something entirely new. The center of a world empire that stretched from the cataracts of the Nile to the shores of the Euphrates, from the deserts of Nubia to the mountains of Anatolia. Yet even in the moment of greatest triumph, the Pharaoh understood that his achievements represented not an end but a beginning. The empire that he had created would require constant attention and careful management if it was to survive and prosper. The institutions that he had established would need to evolve and adapt as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. The legacy that he would leave to his successors would be not just territorial conquests and accumulated wealth, but a new model of statecraft that had transformed the possibilities of human civilization itself. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace lay wrapped in silence and the weight of empire seemed to rest upon his shoulders alone, Thutmose III would often reflect on the journey that had brought him from the shadow of Hatshepsut's regency to the pinnacle of ancient power. The path had been long and difficult, requiring sacrifices and compromises that had tested every aspect of his character and ability. But the result had been worth every effort, the creation of a legacy that would endure long after his own voice had joined the whispers of his ancestors in the eternal silence of the tomb. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Euphrates as Thutmose III stood at the river's edge, his weathered hands tracing the carved stone that marked Egypt's northernmost boundary. Behind him, The rhythmic sound of oars cutting through water carried the weight of history itself Egyptian ships where no Egyptian vessel had ever sailed before. The wind whispered through the reeds, carrying with it the scent of distant mountains, and the promise of empires yet to be conquered. In the 22nd year of his reign, Thutmose III had become something more than a pharaoh. He was the living embodiment of Egypt's reach across the ancient world. His armies had marched from the cataracts of Nubia to the cedar forests of Lebanon, from the gold mines of the eastern desert to the trading ports of the Mediterranean coast. Yet it was here, beside the great river that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that he understood the true magnitude of what he had achieved. The transformation had not come overnight. In the years following his emergence as sole ruler, each campaign had been a calculated step in a grand design that stretched far beyond the ambitions of his predecessors. Where other pharaohs had been content to exact tribute and withdraw, Thutmose III had envisioned something unprecedented, a permanent Egyptian presence in the lands of the Levant, a network of vassal states bound to Egypt not merely by fear, but by the complex web of diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. The genesis of this grand strategy could be traced to the early years of his independent rule, when reports reached Memphis of a coalition forming in the north. The princes of Kadesh, emboldened by Egypt's apparent weakness during the final years of Hatshepsut's reign, had begun to rally other city-states under their banner. From the halls of Megiddo to the chambers of Tunip, whispers of rebellion had grown into open defiance. The tribute that had flowed south for generations had begun to dwindle, and Egyptian merchants reported increasing hostility in markets that had once welcomed them with open arms. It was then that Thutmose III had made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than respond with a single punitive expedition, he would undertake a systematic campaign of conquest and reorganization that would transform the relationship between Egypt and the Levant forever. The young pharaoh, still bearing the scars of his struggles with Hatshepsut's faction, understood that true power lay not in the ability to defeat an enemy once, but in the capacity to prevent future rebellion through the careful application of both force and diplomacy. The preparation for what would become known as the Great Campaign began in the 20th year of Thutmose III's reign, though its roots stretched back to the strategic reforms he had implemented in the years following Hatshepsut's death. The pharaoh had spent considerable time studying the records of his predecessors, particularly those of his grandfather, Thutmose I, who had been the first to carry Egyptian arms to the Euphrates. But where Thutmose I had conducted raids and withdrawn, Thutmose III envisioned permanent occupation. The military machine that assembled at Memphis in the spring of the 21st year was unlike anything Egypt had fielded before. The core of the army consisted of the professional soldiers who had served the pharaoh since his youth, men who had learned their craft in the border skirmishes of Nubia and the garrison duties of the delta fortresses. These were supplemented by contingents from the various nomes of Egypt, each bringing their own specialized skills and equipment. The chariot corps, in particular, had been expanded and reorganized according to principles that Thutmose III had developed through careful study of both Egyptian and foreign military practices. Each chariot was now part of a coordinated unit of 10, with each unit capable of independent action while remaining part of a larger tactical formation. The horses, bred from the finest stock acquired through tribute and trade, were trained not merely for speed, but for endurance and discipline under the chaos of battle. The infantry, too, had been transformed. The traditional Egyptian reliance On archers and spearmen had been expanded to include units trained in the use of bronze axes, curved swords, and even the composite bows that had been adopted from Asiatic designs. More importantly, the army now included a significant number of engineers and siege specialists, men who understood the intricacies of reducing fortified cities without the massive casualties that had characterized earlier campaigns. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Thutmose III's military preparation was his attention to logistics. Previous pharaohs had often relied on living off the land or on the tribute of conquered peoples to sustain their armies. Thutmose III, however, had established a network of supply depots along the coastal route to Asia, each stocked with grain, weapons, and other necessities. This system would allow his forces to maintain their strength even during extended campaigns, freeing them from the vulnerability that had often forced earlier expeditions to withdraw at critical moments. The diplomatic preparation was equally thorough. Egyptian agents had been active throughout the Levant for months before the campaign began, gathering intelligence on the strength of various city-states, the loyalty of their rulers, and the disposition of their populations. More subtly, these agents had also been sowing discord among the coalition that had formed against Egypt, playing upon ancient rivalries and territorial disputes that predated the current crisis. As the army assembled at Memphis, representatives from throughout the Egyptian sphere of influence arrived to pay their respects to the pharaoh. The sight of Nubian princes offering gold and ivory, of Libyan chieftains presenting their finest horses, of Aegean merchants displaying their most precious goods, served as a powerful reminder of the wealth and diversity of the empire that Thutmose III had inherited. It also served as a clear message to any who might question his authority. Egypt's reach extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Nile Valley. The departure from Memphis was itself a spectacle designed to awe both supporters and potential enemies. The pharaoh, resplendent in his battle regalia, led the procession from the royal palace to the harbor where the fleet waited. Behind him marched the elite guard, their bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun, their standards bearing the symbols of a dozen victorious campaigns. The sound of drums and trumpets echoed across the water as the great ships cast off, their holds filled with the supplies and equipment that would sustain the army in the months ahead. As the fleet moved north through the delta, crowds gathered along the banks to witness the departure. To the common people of Egypt, the sight of their pharaoh setting forth at the head of such a mighty host was a source of pride and excitement. But to the priests and nobles who understood the broader implications, it was clear that they were witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in Egyptian history, one that would either establish Egypt as the dominant power in the ancient world or lead to catastrophic defeat. The journey to the coastal plain of Palestine unfolded with the precision of a ritual that had been performed countless times before. The Egyptian army moved along the ancient trade route that connected the Nile Delta to the Levant, a path worn, smoothed by the passage of merchants, diplomats, and armies over the centuries. Yet for all its familiarity, this march carried with it an air of anticipation that set it apart from the routine expeditions of previous years. Thutmose III travelled at the head of the main column, his chariot flanked by the royal bodyguard and the senior officers of his army. The pharaoh's attention to detail was evident in every aspect of the march: the spacing of the units, the positioning of the baggage trains, the deployment of scouts and advance parties. Nothing was left to chance, for he understood that the success of the campaign would depend as much on the army's ability to reach the battlefield in good order as on its performance once battle was joined, as the army moved through the settled lands of the Delta. The response of the population provided a clear indication of the pharaoh's popularity among his subjects. Farmers left their fields to line the roadside, offering bread and beer to the passing soldiers. Children ran alongside the chariots, their laughter mingling with the sound of wheels and hooves. In the larger towns, the local officials organized elaborate welcoming ceremonies, complete with musicians and dancers who performed ancient songs of victory and conquest. The transition from the familiar landscape of Egypt to the more uncertain terrain of the coastal plain was marked by subtle changes in the army's demeanor. The relaxed banter that had characterized the early stages of the march gave way to the focused attention of soldiers entering hostile territory. Scouts ranged farther ahead, their reports becoming increasingly detailed and frequent. The evening, camps were established with greater care, their perimeters more carefully guarded, their arrangements more suited to rapid deployment in case of attack. At Gaza, the last major Egyptian stronghold, before entering the heart of the contested region, Thutmose III paused to receive the final intelligence reports from his agents. In the field, the news they brought was both encouraging and concerning. The coalition that had formed against Egypt was indeed formidable, including not only the traditional enemies of Egyptian expansion, but also several city-states that had previously been loyal vassals. The total force that awaited him was estimated at nearly equal to his own, and they had chosen their position with considerable strategic acumen. The enemy had concentrated their forces at Megiddo, a city that commanded the crucial pass-through, the Carmel Ridge. From this position, they could control the main route between Egypt and the northern Levant, effectively cutting off Egyptian influence in the region. Moreover, the city's strong fortifications and abundant water supply made it an ideal base for a defensive campaign that could potentially outlast the Egyptian expedition. That the challenge facing Thutmose III was thus not merely military but logistical and political as well. A prolonged siege would strain his supply lines and might encourage other potential enemies to join the coalition. A hasty assault, however, could result in catastrophic losses that would undermine his authority throughout the empire. The pharaoh needed a strategy that would achieve a decisive victory while minimizing the risks inherent in either approach. It was during the councils of war held at Gaza that Thutmose III first revealed the bold plan that would become the stuff of military legend. Rather than taking the obvious approach to Megiddo along the well-traveled coastal route, he proposed to lead his army through the narrow mountain pass of Arutna, a route so treacherous that no major force had ever attempted to traverse it. The advantages of this approach were clear. It would bring the Egyptian army directly to the plain of Megiddo, bypassing the defensive positions that the enemy had prepared along the expected routes of advance. The risks, however, were equally apparent. The pass was so narrow that the army would be forced to advance in single file for much of the distance, making it vulnerable to ambush and preventing any possibility of retreat if the enemy discovered the movement. Moreover, the timing would have to be perfect. The entire army would need to traverse the pass and deploy on the plain before the enemy could react, a feat that would require not only military skill but also considerable luck. The reaction of the senior officers to this proposal was mixed. The younger commanders, many of whom had served under Thutmose III since his youth, were enthusiastic about the bold nature of the plan. The older veterans, however, were more cautious, pointing out the numerous ways in which the operation could end in disaster. The debate continued for several days. with the Pharaoh listening carefully to all viewpoints while maintaining his own counsel. In the end, it was Thutmose III's understanding of both his own army and his enemies that decided the issue. He knew that his forces were supremely confident in their ability to execute complex maneuvers under pressure, having been trained extensively in just such operations. He also understood that the enemy coalition, despite its numerical strength, was hampered by the need to coordinate the actions of multiple independent commanders, each with their own agenda and priorities. The decision to proceed with the route was announced to the army on the morning of the departure from Gaza. The Pharaoh's address to his troops was both inspiring and practical, acknowledging the risks while emphasizing the opportunities that success would bring. He reminded them of their previous victories, of the training that had prepared them for this moment, and of the glory that would be theirs if they succeeded in this most audacious of military operations. The approach to the pass of Aruna began in the pre-dawn darkness, with the Egyptian army moving in a silence that seemed to press against the surrounding hills like a physical presence. The narrow defile that led into the mountains was little more than a goat track, winding between rocky outcroppings that seemed to close in around the advancing column. The sound of thousands of feet and hooves was muffled by the confined space, creating an atmosphere of hushed anticipation that communicated itself to every man in the army. Thutmose III rode at the very front of the column, his presence serving as both inspiration and reassurance to the soldiers who followed. The Pharaoh's decision to personally lead the most dangerous part of the advance was not merely symbolic, it was a practical demonstration of his confidence in the operation and his willingness to share the risks that he was asking his men to. Except, behind him, the army stretched back through the pass in a line that seemed to have no end, each unit maintaining its position through discipline and training rather than through any possibility of visual contact with the overall formation. The passage through the mountains was a test of endurance as much as courage. The route climbed steadily through terrain that became increasingly difficult, with loose stones and narrow ledges that required constant attention from both men and animals. The chariots, in particular, presented a constant challenge, their wheels finding little purchase on the rocky surface and their teams struggling to maintain their footing on the steep inclines. Yet despite these difficulties, the army maintained its schedule with remarkable precision. The careful planning that had preceded the movement was evident in every detail. The positioning of engineers to clear obstacles, the deployment of scouts to watch for enemy activity, the establishment of communication posts to maintain contact between the head and tail of the column. The Pharaoh's attention to logistics was particularly apparent in the arrangement of supply trains, which had been organized to ensure that food and water would be available at regular intervals throughout the passage. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat within the pass became increasingly oppressive. The rocky walls seemed to trap and concentrate the solar radiation, creating conditions that tested the endurance of even the most hardened soldiers. Water became a precious commodity, carefully rationed according to the Pharaoh's precise instructions, with priority given to the horses and draft animals, whose performance would be crucial in the battles. Ahead, the psychological pressure of the passage was as significant as the physical challenges. The soldiers were acutely aware that they were completely committed to the operation. Retreat was impossible given the narrow confines of the pass, and any enemy action could trap them in a position where their superior numbers and equipment would be meaningless. The knowledge that their fate depended entirely on the success of the Pharaoh's plan created a sense of unity and purpose that transcended the traditional divisions between units and ranks. It was during the hottest part of the day that the first reports came back from the scouts who had been sent ahead to reconnoiter the exit from the pass. The news was both encouraging and alarming. The route was clear of enemy forces, but the plain of Megiddo stretched out below them in full view of the city's walls. The element of surprise that was so crucial to the success of the operation would depend on the speed with which the army could deploy once it emerged from the mountains. Thutmose III's response to this intelligence was characteristic of his approach to command. Rather than attempting to control every detail of the deployment from his position at the head of the column, he dispatched trusted officers to the rear with specific instructions for each unit commander. These orders were precise and comprehensive, covering not only the initial deployment but also the contingencies that might arise if the enemy reacted more quickly than expected. The exit from the pass came with a suddenness that was almost shocking. After the confined journey through the mountains, one moment the army was threading its way between narrow rock walls. The next, it was emerging onto the broad plain that stretched toward the walls of Megiddo. The city itself was visible in the distance, its massive fortifications clearly outlined against the afternoon sky, while the enemy camp could be seen spreading across the valley floor like a vast carpet of tents and banners. The deployment of the Egyptian army on the plain of Megiddo was a masterpiece of military organization. Despite the constraints imposed by the narrow exit from the pass, the various units moved into their assigned positions with a precision that spoke to years of training and experience. The chariot corps, in particular, demonstrated the flexibility that had been built into their organization, with individual squadrons wheeling into line as soon as they had sufficient space to maneuver. The infantry deployment was equally impressive, with the various specialized units taking their positions according to the battle plan that had been developed during the march. The archers moved to elevated positions that would give them clear fields of fire, while the spearmen formed the main battle line that would bear the brunt of any enemy assault. The engineers, meanwhile, began the immediate task of preparing defensive positions that could be used if the initial assault proved unsuccessful. The reaction of the enemy coalition to the sudden appearance of the Egyptian army on the plain was initially one of confusion and disbelief. The elaborate defensive preparations that had been made along the expected routes of advance were suddenly irrelevant, and the carefully coordinated plans that had been developed by the various allied commanders were thrown into chaos. The sight of the Pharaoh's banners streaming in the wind across the plain that they had thought secure was a psychological shock that would have profound consequences for the battle ahead. As the sun began to set on the day of the passage, Thutmose III stood on a small rise that commanded a view of the entire battlefield. Around him, the Egyptian army was settling into its positions with the quiet efficiency of a force that had complete confidence in its leadership and its cause. The Pharaoh's gaze swept across the plain, taking in the disposition of his own forces and the movements of the enemy, calculating the opportunities and risks that the next day would bring. Dawn broke over the plain of Megiddo with a clarity that seemed to promise either glory or catastrophe. The Egyptian army, having spent the night in careful preparation, stood ready in formations that reflected both traditional Egyptian military doctrine and the innovations that Thutmose III had introduced during his years of independent rule. The Pharaoh himself, clad in the full regalia of his office, moved among his troops in the final moments before battle, his presence serving as both inspiration and assurance that the gods of Egypt were with them in this distant land. The enemy coalition had spent the night in frantic preparation, their commanders struggling to adapt plans that had been developed for entirely different circumstances. The psychological impact of the Egyptian army's unexpected appearance on the plain had been compounded by the obvious skill with which the maneuver had been executed. The realization that they faced not merely a numerous enemy, but a supremely well-led one had begun to spread through the ranks, creating doubt where confidence had existed the day before. The battle itself began with a series of skirmishes between the opposing cavalry forces, each side probing for weaknesses in the enemy's formation while attempting to gain information about their intentions. The Egyptian chariots, operating in the coordinated squadrons that had been developed during the previous years, demonstrated their superiority in both equipment and training. The composite bows used by the Egyptian chariot crews had a longer range than the weapons of their opponents, while their horses showed the stamina and discipline that came from careful breeding and training. It was during these preliminary engagements that the first signs of the enemy coalition's fundamental weakness became apparent. The various contingents that made up the Allied force had different tactical doctrines, different command structures, and different levels of motivation. What had looked formidable on paper began to reveal itself as a collection of individual armies that happened to be fighting on the same side rather than a unified military force. Thutmose, III's exploitation of this weakness was both immediate and systematic. Rather than attempting to break through the enemy line at a single point, he launched a series of coordinated attacks that forced the Allied commanders to respond to multiple threats simultaneously. The Pharaoh's use of his reserve forces was particularly skillful, with fresh units being committed at precisely the moments when enemy reserves were already engaged elsewhere. The decisive moment of the battle came when the Egyptian chariot corps succeeded in breaking through the enemy's left flank, threatening to cut off the retreat route to Megiddo. The Allied commanders, faced with the prospect of being trapped on the open plain, began to order withdrawals that quickly became a general retreat. The careful formations that had been established during the night dissolved into confusion as individual units attempted to reach the safety of the city walls. The Egyptian pursuit was conducted with the same systematic approach that had characterized the battle itself. Rather than allowing his forces to scatter in an uncontrolled chase, Thutmose III maintained unit cohesion and directed the pursuit toward specific objectives. The result was that the enemy retreat, while successful in saving the majority of their forces, left behind a substantial amount of equipment and supplies that would prove crucial to the siege operations that followed. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true extent of the Egyptian victory. The enemy coalition, which had seemed so formidable in the intelligence reports, had been decisively defeated with relatively light Egyptian casualties. More importantly, the political consequences of the victory were immediate and far-reaching. Several of the Allied city-states that had joined the coalition began to send envoys to the Egyptian camp, seeking to negotiate separate peace agreements before the situation deteriorated further. The siege of Megiddo that followed the battle was a demonstration of the comprehensive nature of Thutmose III's military reforms. The walls of the city, while formidable, were not impregnable, and the Egyptian engineers had both the equipment and the expertise necessary to conduct a systematic reduction of the fortifications. The siege works that were constructed around the city were marvels of military engineering, combining traditional Egyptian techniques with innovations that had been developed through careful study of Asiatic practices. The psychological warfare that accompanied the siege was equally sophisticated. The Pharaoh's treatment of prisoners and deserters was calculated to encourage further defections from the city's defenders. while the visible strength of the Egyptian positions made it clear that relief was unlikely. The message was unmistakable: resistance would only prolong the suffering of the population, while submission would bring the benefits of Egyptian protection and prosperity. The fall of Megiddo, when it came, was less a matter of military conquest than of political collapse. The city's leaders, faced with the reality of their situation and the evident determination of the Egyptian forces, chose to negotiate rather than face the destruction that continued resistance would bring. The terms that were ultimately agreed upon were generous by the standards of the time, reflecting Thutmose III's understanding that lasting peace required more than mere military victory. The tribute that was extracted from Megiddo and its allies was substantial, but it was not merely punitive. The gold, silver, and precious goods that made their way to Egypt were accompanied by skilled craftsmen, exotic animals, and rare materials that enriched Egyptian culture as much as they filled the royal treasury. The pharaoh's vision extended beyond immediate military advantage to encompass the long-term integration of the conquered territories into the Egyptian sphere of influence. The diplomatic revolution that followed the victory at Megiddo was as significant as the military triumph itself. The city-states of the Levant, having witnessed the effectiveness of Egyptian arms and the sophistication of Egyptian administration, began to compete for the pharaoh's favor. The tribute that had once been extracted through force now flowed freely, accompanied by requests for Egyptian protection against other potential threats. The success at Megiddo had established Thutmose III as the dominant power in the southern Levant, but the pharaoh's ambitions extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Egyptian influence. In the years following the great victory, he launched a series of campaigns that would carry Egyptian arms to the very heart of the Mesopotamian world, establishing a network of vassal states and client kingdoms that stretched from the cataracts of the Nile to the headwaters of the Euphrates. The strategic vision that guided these northern campaigns was fundamentally different from the raidant withdraw tactics that had characterized earlier Egyptian expeditions. Thutmose III understood that permanent control of the trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia required not merely military victory but the establishment of a stable political and economic system that would serve Egyptian interests while providing tangible benefits to the local populations. The first of these campaigns, launched in the 23rd year of his reign, was directed against the city of Kadesh, which had served as the focal point of resistance to Egyptian expansion. The siege of this formidable fortress was a masterpiece of military engineering, with the Egyptian forces employing siege towers, battering rams, and undermining techniques that had been perfected through years of experience in similar operations. The fall of Kadesh sent shockwaves throughout the region, as it had been widely regarded as impregnable. The city's massive fortifications, built on a commanding position overlooking the Orontes River, had withstood numerous sieges by various armies. Over the centuries, the fact that the Egyptians had succeeded where so many others had failed was a powerful demonstration of both their military capabilities and their determination to establish permanent control over the region. The administration that Thutmose established in the conquered territories was notably different from the traditional Egyptian approach to foreign rule. Rather than simply extracting tribute and leaving local governance in the hands of traditional rulers, the pharaoh implemented a system of direct Egyptian oversight that ensured both efficient administration and reliable loyalty. Egyptian officials were appointed to key positions in the local governments, while carefully selected members of the local elite were brought to Egypt for education and training in Egyptian administrative practices. This policy of cultural integration was perhaps the most innovative aspect of Thutmose III's imperial system. The sons of conquered rulers were not held as hostages in the traditional sense, but rather were educated at the Egyptian court as future leaders who would understand and appreciate the benefits of Egyptian rule when they returned to their homelands. They brought with them not only loyalty to the pharaoh, but also knowledge of Egyptian administrative, military, and cultural practices that would help to bind their territories more closely to Egypt. The economic benefits of this system were substantial and immediate. The tribute that flowed to Egypt from the conquered territories was not merely a drain on local resources, but part of a broader trading network that brought prosperity to both Egypt and its vassals. Egyptian merchants enjoyed privileged access to the markets of the Levant, while Asiatic goods found ready markets in Egypt's cities and towns. The result was a level of economic integration that had never before been achieved in the ancient world. The military campaigns that established this system were characterized by the same attention to detail and systematic approach that had marked the victory at Megiddo. Each operation was carefully planned and executed, with extensive logistical preparation and comprehensive intelligence gathering. The Egyptian army that moved north year after year was not merely a raiding force, but a well-organized military machine, capable of sustained operations far from its home base. The resistance that these campaigns encountered varied considerably from one region to another. Some city-states, having witnessed the fate of those who opposed Egypt, chose to submit without a fight, earning favorable treatment and positions within the new imperial system. Others, particularly those with strong traditional ties to Mesopotamian powers, fought with the desperation of those who understood that defeat would mean the end of their independence. The most significant of these resistant powers was the kingdom of Mitanni, which controlled much of northern Mesopotamia and had long been Egypt's primary rival for influence in the region. The conflict between Egypt and Mitanni was not merely a struggle for territorial control, but a clash between two different approaches to imperial organization, where Egypt sought to establish direct control over key territories and trade routes. Mitanni preferred a looser system of alliances and tributary relationships. The war between Egypt and Mitanni unfolded over several years, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory in the traditional sense. The Egyptian forces succeeded in capturing several key cities and establishing control over important trade routes, but the Mitannian kingdom proved too large and too well organized to be completely conquered. The conflict eventually evolved into a complex diplomatic dance, with both sides seeking to gain advantage through alliances with smaller powers, rather than through direct military confrontation. It was during this period that Thutmose III's diplomatic skills proved to be as impressive as his military abilities. The pharaoh's approach to international relations was characterized by the same systematic thinking that had made his military campaigns so successful. He understood that lasting peace required not merely the defeat of enemies, but the creation of a stable balance of power that would serve Egyptian interests while providing security for all parties involved. The treaty that eventually ended the conflict with Mitanni was a masterpiece of diplomatic craftsmanship. Rather than attempting to impose a humiliating peace on his rival, Thutmose III negotiated an agreement that acknowledged Mitannian control over its core territories while establishing clear Egyptian dominance in the southern Levant. The border between the two empires was carefully demarcated, with both sides agreeing to respect the territorial integrity of the other. More importantly, the treaty established a framework for ongoing diplomatic relations that would survive long after both Thutmose III and his Mitannian counterpart had passed from the scene. the exchange of ambassadors, the regulation of trade, and the establishment of procedures for resolving disputes were all addressed in detail, creating a system that would serve as a model for international relations throughout the ancient world. Success of this diplomatic revolution was evident in the transformation of the regional balance of power. Where once the Levant had been a battleground between competing empires, it now became a zone of relative stability and prosperity. The smaller city-states, freed from the constant threat of invasion and conquest, were able to focus on trade and cultural development. The result was a flowering of art, literature, and learning that would influence the development of civilization throughout the Mediterranean world. The continuing echo of chariot wheels along the ancient roads, the gentle murmur of trade negotiations in a dozen languages, and the steady rhythm of tribute caravans making their way toward Memphis all bore witness to the transformation that Thutmose III had wrought. The pharaoh had not merely conquered territory, he had fundamentally reshaped the political and economic landscape of the ancient Near East, creating a system that would endure for centuries and influence the development of imperial administration. Throughout the classical world, as the sun set over the cedar forests of Lebanon, Egyptian officials consulted their papyrus records, while Asiatic merchants counted their profits in Egyptian gold. The great experiment in empire building had succeeded beyond even the pharaoh's ambitious dreams, creating a legacy that would outlast the monuments of stone and bronze that celebrated his military victories. In the gentle evening breeze that carried the scent of spices from distant lands, the future whispered of glories yet to be achieved, and challenges yet to be faced. The dust of 17 campaigns had settled across the territories of Egypt's vast empire, and in the quiet chambers of the royal palace at Thebes, Thutmose III found himself transformed. No longer did he spend his mornings reviewing battle plans or studying the movements of distant armies. Instead, he walked through the cool corridors of power with the measured step of a ruler, whose greatest conquests now lay not in foreign lands, but in the careful cultivation of an empire that would outlast the memory of his wars. The pharaoh's hands, once calloused from wielding sword and bow, now traced the delicate lines of architectural drawings spread across cedar tables. His eyes, which had once scanned horizons for enemy formations, now studied the precise measurements of temple foundations and the graceful curves of obelisks yet to be carved. The transformation was as profound as it was natural. The warrior king had become the master, builder of his age, in the 31st year of his reign. With the empire secure and tribute flowing like the annual flood of the Nile, Thutmose III turned his attention to projects that would speak to future generations in the language of stone. The great temple complex at Karnak, already ancient when he first grasped the crook and flail, became the canvas upon which he would paint his vision of divine kingship and eternal Egypt. The festival hall, known to later generations as the Okmenu, rose from the sacred precinct like a forest of stone columns. Here, Thutmose III conceived a revolutionary designer hall supported by tent-pole columns that echoed the military pavilions of his campaign years, yet transformed into something transcendent. The columns, carved to resemble the sturdy poles of royal tents, supported a roof that seemed to float weightlessly above the heads of worshippers and priests. Within this sacred space, the pharaoh commissioned artists to create something unprecedented. An Egyptian botanical garden carved in stone. Upon the walls of the festival hall, skilled craftsmen chiseled representations of the exotic plants and animals that Thutmose III had encountered during his campaigns in the Levant: Syrian cedar, Asiatic flowers, and strange beasts from distant lands bloomed eternally in limestone, creating a garden that would never wither, never fade, never know the touch of winter. These carved gardens spoke to a deeper truth about the Pharaoh's vision. Having conquered the known world, he sought now to bring all of creation under the protection of the Egyptian gods. The exotic plants were not merely decorative, they were symbols of a unified world, where the bounty of all lands found its proper place within the cosmic order centered on Egypt. The Pharaoh's architects, led by the brilliant Amenhotep, son of Hapu, worked tirelessly to translate their master's vision into reality. They developed new techniques for quarrying and transporting the massive granite blocks that would become obelisks. They perfected the art of raising these towering monuments, each one a prayer in stone reaching toward the heavens. 7 obelisks, Thutmose III commissioned during his mature years, each one marking a significant achievement of his reign. The largest, standing nearly 100 feet tall, was carved from a single piece of pink granite quarried at Aswan. The logistics of moving such a monument northward to Thebes required an engineering feat that rivaled his military campaigns. In complexity, teams of skilled workers carved channels in the quarry face, driving wooden wedges into the stone and soaking them with water. As the wood expanded, it split the granite along precise lines, freeing the future obelisk from the living rock. The process took months, requiring patience and precision that spoke to the pharaoh's evolution from the impetuous young warrior to the measured master of his craft. The transport of the obelisk became an event that drew spectators from across the empire. Massive wooden sledges, reinforced with bronze fittings, carried the stone giant to the banks of the Nile. There, specially constructed bargessen of the largest vessels ever built in ancient Egypt, to carry their precious cargo northward. During the flood season, when the river ran high and strong, the journey from Aswan to Thebes became a triumphal procession lasting weeks. Along the banks of the Nile, crowds gathered to witness the passage of the stone monument. Children ran alongside the slow-moving barges, their laughter echoing across the water. Farmers left their fields to watch the pharaoh's great work pass by, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing history in the making at Thebes. The raising of the obelisk required every skill that Egyptian engineers had developed over centuries. Massive earth ramps were constructed, allowing teams of workers to drag the monument up to the level of its final position. Bronze-tipped levers, operated by dozens of skilled workmen, gradually tilted the obelisk into its vertical position. The moment when the great stone shaft finally stood upright was marked by celebrations that lasted for days. The inscriptions carved into these obelisks revealed the mature pharaoh's understanding of his place in the cosmic order. No longer did he simply proclaim his victories over foreign enemies. Instead, he spoke of his role as the beloved son of Amun-Ra, the divine intermediary who brought order to chaos, light to darkness, truth to the world. One inscription, carved in hieroglyphs that seemed to dance across the polished granite surface, spoke of his achievements in language that was both humble and magnificent. I am the king who speaks with his own mouth, whose plans are excellent, whose counsel is beneficial. Each word that comes forth from my mouth is accomplished immediately. I am the good shepherd who keeps alive his flock, the Lord who makes his subjects live, while the great monuments rose toward the heavens. Thutmose III devoted equal attention to the less visible but equally important work of governing an empire that stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the cedar forests of Lebanon. The administrative system he developed during his mature years became the foundation upon which Egyptian power would rest for centuries to come. The pharaoh understood that military conquest was meaningless without the organizational framework to maintain control over distant territories. Drawing upon the lessons learned during his campaigns, he created a system of provincial governance that balanced local autonomy with central authority. Egyptian governors, chosen for their loyalty and competence, were appointed to oversee the major administrative centers throughout the empire. These governors, known as the king's sons, held authority that extended far beyond their immediate territories. They were responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and ensuring that the flow of goods and information continued uninterrupted between the provinces and the royal capital. Yet they were also expected to serve as cultural ambassadors, spreading Egyptian values and customs throughout the conquered territories. The tribute system that Thutmose III perfected represented a masterpiece of administrative efficiency. Rather than simply demanding arbitrary payments from subject peoples, the pharaoh's officials conducted careful assessments of each region's productive capacity. Agricultural areas were expected to provide grain, livestock, and precious textiles. Mining regions contributed metals and gemstones. Coastal cities supplied exotic goods, obtained through trade with distant lands. The annual tribute ceremonies at Thebes became spectacular displays of the empire's wealth and diversity. Representatives from dozens of subject peoples would arrive at the capital, their caravans laden with the finest products of their homelands. Nubians brought gold and ivory, their dark skin gleaming with precious oils. Syrians carried bolts of purple-dyed cloth and cedar wood. Cypriots offered copper, ingots, and fine pottery. The very diversity of these offerings spoke to the success of Thutmose III's imperial vision. The pharaoh himself presided over these ceremonies, seated upon the golden throne in the great hall of the palace. His presence transformed what might have been mere administrative proceedings into religious rituals that reinforced the cosmic order. Each tribute bearer knelt before the divine king, offering the products of their land as acknowledgement of Egypt's supremacy and the pharaoh's divine mandate. The records of these tribute payments, meticulously maintained by the royal scribes, provide insight into the staggering wealth that flowed into Egypt during Thutmose III's reign. In a single year, the tribute from Nubia alone included 8,000 pounds of gold, quantities of precious stones, exotic animal skins, and live animals for the royal menageries. The Syrian territories contributed timber, oils, wines, and skilled craftsmen whose talents enriched Egyptian culture. Beyond the collection of tribute, Thutmose III's administration developed sophisticated systems for managing this wealth. Royal storehouses, built to designs that maximized preservation and security, were constructed throughout Egypt. These vast complexes, with their thick walls and carefully controlled access, became the foundation of Egyptian economic power. Grain stores could feed the population during years of poor harvest. Weapon stockpiles ensured that the army could be equipped at a moment's notice. Treasure chambers held the gold and precious stones that funded diplomatic missions and public works. The pharaoh's understanding of economics extended beyond simple accumulation of wealth. He recognized that prosperity required the careful management of resources and the development of productive capacity. Under his guidance, Egyptian agriculture reached new heights of efficiency and sophistication. New crops, introduced from conquered territories, diversified the kingdom's agricultural base. Advanced irrigation techniques, developed by royal engineers, brought previously unusable land under cultivation. The workshops of royal craftsmen, supported by the wealth flowing from the empire, produced goods of unprecedented quality and artistry. Egyptian metalworkers, supplied with the finest raw materials from around the known world, created weapons and jewelry that became legendary throughout the ancient world. Textile workers, using techniques learned from Syrian and Mesopotamian masters, produced fabrics that were prized from Nubia to Anatolia. The pharaoh's administrative reforms extended to the very structure of Egyptian society. The traditional bureaucracy, while maintained in its essential form, was expanded and refined to meet the demands of governing an empire. New positions were created for specialists in foreign affairs, military logistics, and provincial administration. The scribal schools, always important in Egyptian society, became centers of learning where young men prepared for careers in the expanding imperial bureaucracy. One of Thutmose III's most innovative administrative achievements was the development of a diplomatic corps that could function effectively across the diverse cultures of his empire. Egyptian diplomats, trained in the languages and customs of foreign peoples, served as the pharaoh's eyes and ears throughout the known world. They negotiated treaties, gathered intelligence, and ensured that Egypt's interests were protected in the complex web of international relations. The diplomatic correspondence of this period, preserved on clay tablets found in the archives of various ancient cities, reveals the sophisticated level of international relations that existed during Thutmose III's reign. The pharaoh exchanged letters with kings and rulers throughout the Near East, discussing everything from trade agreements to royal marriages. These documents show a world where Egypt was recognized as the dominant power, but where diplomacy and negotiation were preferred to military force whenever possible. The legal system that Thutmose III refined during his mature years reflected his deep understanding of the diverse peoples under his rule. While Egyptian law remained supreme throughout the empire, local customs and traditions were respected and incorporated into the broader legal framework. This flexible approach to justice helped maintain stability in the conquered territories and reduce the likelihood of rebellion. Royal judges, appointed by the pharaoh and trained in both Egyptian law and local customs, traveled throughout the empire to hear cases and dispense justice. Their decisions were recorded and preserved, creating a body of legal precedent that guided future judgments. The fairness and consistency of this system became one of the foundations of Egyptian imperial success. As the empire prospered under his wise administration, Thutmose III turned his attention to the cultivation of learning and the arts. The pharaoh understood that true immortality lay not merely in military conquests or administrative achievements, but in the cultural legacy that would inspire future generations. Under his patronage, Egyptian civilization reached heights of artistic and intellectual achievement that would influence the ancient world for centuries to come. The royal workshops, supplied with the finest materials and staffed by the most skilled craftsmen in the empire, became centers of innovation and creativity. The pharaoh himself took an active interest in the work being produced, often visiting the workshops to observe the craftsmen at their labor and to offer suggestions for improvements. His presence inspired the artisans to push the boundaries of their craft, creating works of unprecedented beauty and sophistication. The tomb of Thutmose III, carved deep into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, became a canvas for artistic innovation. The pharaoh commissioned artists to create something entirely newer, complete illustrated version of the Amduat, the ancient Egyptian guide to the afterlife. The walls of the tomb were covered with scenes depicting the pharaoh's journey through the underworld, but these were not mere copies of traditional funerary art. Instead, they represented a revolutionary approach to religious illustration that combined ancient wisdom with contemporary artistic techniques. The artists working on the royal tomb developed new methods for achieving depth and perspective in their paintings. The traditional flat, two-dimensional style of Egyptian art was subtly modified to create a sense of movement and three-dimensional space. Figures seemed to move through the painted landscapes with a grace and naturalness that had never been achieved before. The use of color became more sophisticated, with subtle gradations and shading that gave the painted scenes a lifelike quality. The pharaoh's interest in artistic innovation extended beyond his own tomb to the decoration of temples and public buildings throughout the empire. Egyptian artists, encouraged by royal patronage and exposed to artistic traditions from throughout the known world, developed new styles and techniques that enriched the visual culture of the ancient world. The hybrid artistic styles that emerged during this period reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Thutmose III's empire. Music, too, flourished under the pharaoh's patronage. The royal court became a center for musical innovation, where traditional Egyptian instruments were joined by exotic instruments from conquered territories. The haunting melodies of Syrian lyres blended with the powerful rhythms of Nubian drums. New musical compositions, created for royal ceremonies and religious festivals, incorporated elements from throughout the empire. The pharaoh himself was said to be an accomplished musician, skilled in playing the ancient Egyptian harp. Court musicians composed songs celebrating his achievements, but these were not mere propaganda. Instead, they represented sophisticated musical compositions that explored themes of divine kingship, cosmic order, and the pharaoh's role as the earthly representative of the gods. Literature, too, experienced a golden age under Thutmose III's patronage. The royal scribes, working in the palace's expanded library, produced works that combined traditional Egyptian wisdom with new ideas encountered through contact with foreign cultures. The pharaoh commissioned new versions of ancient texts, updated with contemporary language and enriched with insights gained from his extensive travels and military campaigns. One of the most significant literary achievements of this period was the compilation of the Annals of Thutmose III, a comprehensive record of the pharaoh's military campaigns and administrative achievements. This work, carved into the walls of the temple at Karnak, represented a new form of historical writing that combined factual accuracy with literary sophistication. The annals were not merely a list of victories and conquests, but a carefully crafted narrative that explained the pharaoh's actions in terms of divine will and cosmic order. The language of the annals was both precise and poetic, capable of conveying complex military strategies while also inspiring religious devotion. The scribes who created this masterpiece drew upon centuries of Egyptian literary tradition while also incorporating new narrative techniques that made the text more engaging and accessible to readers. The pharaoh's commitment to learning extended to the encouragement of scientific and technical innovation. The royal court included scholars who studied astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and medicine. These learned men, supported by the wealth of the empire and encouraged by the pharaoh's personal interest in their work, made discoveries that advanced human knowledge in multiple fields. Egyptian astronomers, working with instruments of unprecedented precision, created star charts that were used throughout the ancient world for navigation and calendar making. The accurate measurement of celestial movements became the foundation for improved agricultural planning and more precise religious festivals. The pharaoh himself was said to possess deep knowledge of astronomy, often consulting with the royal astronomers before making important decisions. Medical knowledge also advanced significantly during this period. Egyptian physicians, already renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill, gained access to new treatments and remedies discovered in distant lands. The pharaoh's court physicians compiled medical texts that combined traditional Egyptian healing wisdom with new knowledge acquired through contact with foreign medical traditions. The engineering achievements of Thutmose III's reign represented the culmination of centuries of Egyptian technical development. The construction of his great monuments required innovations in quarrying, transportation, and construction that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with ancient technology. The techniques developed by his engineers were adopted throughout the empire and influenced construction projects for generations to come. The pharaoh's interest in innovation extended to military technology as well. Egyptian weapons makers, working with the finest materials available and inspired by contact with foreign military traditions, created new designs for swords, spears, and composite bows. These innovations gave Egyptian forces a technological advantage that helped maintain the empire's military supremacy. The chariot workshops of Memphis became centers of technical innovation, where skilled craftsmen developed lighter, stronger, and more maneuverable designs. The Egyptian war chariot, already feared throughout the ancient world, was refined and improved until it became the ultimate expression of ancient military technology. These innovations were not merely technical achievements, they represented the pharaoh's commitment to maintaining Egypt's military edge through continuous improvement and adaptation in the 40th year of his reign. Thutmose III had become a figure of almost mythical stature. The young man who had once stood in the shadow of Hatshepsut was now acknowledged as the greatest pharaoh of his age, a ruler whose wisdom was sought by kings and princes throughout the known world. Yet with this recognition came a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that came with absolute power. The pharaoh's daily routine reflected the evolution of his kingship, where once he had risen before dawn to review military dispatches and plan campaigns, he now began each day with quiet contemplation in the private chapel of his palace. The morning prayers, offered to Amun-Ra as the sun rose over the eastern cliffs of Thebes, had become not merely ritual obligations, but profound spiritual exercises that grounded him in the cosmic order he was ordained to maintain. The wisdom that Thutmose III displayed in his mature years manifested itself in countless ways. His approach to governance became more nuanced, more attuned to the subtle currents of human nature and political necessity. He understood that true power lay not in the ability to compel obedience through force, but in the capacity to inspire loyalty through justice and wisdom. The pharaoh's judicial decisions, recorded by the royal scribes and studied by legal scholars throughout the empire, revealed a mind capable of perceiving the deeper truths that lay beneath surface conflicts. When provincial governors brought disputes to the royal court, Thutmose III would listen patiently to all parties, asking questions that revealed the underlying causes of the conflicts. His judgments were renowned for their fairness and for the ability to resolve disputes in ways that strengthened rather than weakened the bonds that held the empire together. One such case, preserved in the royal archives, involved a territorial dispute between two Syrian city-states that had been subject to Egypt for more than a decade. The conflict had escalated to the point where both sides were threatening to appeal to foreign powers for support, potentially destabilizing the entire region. Lesser rulers might have simply imposed a solution by force, but Thutmose III chose a different path. The pharaoh summoned representatives from both cities to his court, where he listened to their arguments with the patience of a true judge. Rather than simply ruling in favor of one side or the other, he proposed a solution that addressed the underlying economic concerns that had fueled the territorial dispute. New trade routes were established that benefited both cities, while the disputed territory was placed under direct Egyptian administration, with the revenues used to fund public works projects that served both communities. That the wisdom of this solution became apparent over time. Rather than creating winners and losers, the Pharaoh's judgment created a framework for cooperation that made both cities more prosperous and more firmly bound to Egyptian rule. The case became a model for resolving similar disputes throughout the empire, demonstrating that true wisdom lay in understanding the deeper needs and motivations of all parties involved. The Pharaoh's approach to religious matters also reflected his mature understanding of leadership. While he remained deeply devoted to the traditional gods of Egypt, he recognized that the religious diversity of his empire required a more inclusive approach to spiritual matters. Egyptian temples were built throughout the conquered territories, but local deities were often incorporated into the Egyptian pantheon rather than being suppressed or destroyed. This religious tolerance was not merely a matter of political expediency. It reflected Thutmose III's growing understanding of the universal nature of divine truth. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the Pharaoh would walk through the gardens of his palace, he would often contemplate the ways in which different peoples understood the divine presence that guided the universe. These meditations led him to a deeper appreciation of the wisdom traditions that existed throughout his empire. The Pharaoh's personal relationships also reflected his evolution as a leader. His marriage to the daughter of a Syrian prince, arranged years earlier for political reasons, had developed into a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The queen, educated in both Egyptian and Syrian traditions, served as an unofficial ambassador between the two cultures, helping to bridge the gap between ruler and ruled. Their children, raised in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the royal court, represented the future of Egyptian civilization. The Pharaoh took a personal interest in their education, ensuring that they learned not only the traditional skills of Egyptian royalty, but also the languages and customs of the diverse peoples who made up the empire. This preparation was not merely academic, it was intended to create a new generation of leaders who could maintain and expand the cultural synthesis that had become the hallmark of Thutmose III's reign. The Pharaoh's relationship with his advisors also evolved during his mature years. The council of nobles and high priests who assisted in governing the empire was no longer simply a group of subordinates carrying out royal commands. Instead, it had become a collegial body of experienced administrators who worked together to address the complex challenges facing the empire. Thutmose II's ability to delegate authority while maintaining ultimate control demonstrated his confidence in his own leadership and his trust in the competence of his subordinates. He understood that no single person, regardless of their wisdom or energy, could personally manage every aspect of governing an empire that stretched across thousands of miles and encompassed dozens of different cultures. The regular councils, held in the great hall of the palace, became forums for genuine discussion and debate. The Pharaoh would present issues facing the empire and invite his advisors to offer their perspectives and recommendations. These sessions, conducted with the formality befitting the royal court but also with the intellectual rigor of a scholarly symposium, produced policy decisions that reflected the collective wisdom of the empire's most experienced administrators. The Pharaoh's approach to succession planning also demonstrated his mature understanding of kingship. Rather than simply designating an heir and leaving the details of the transition to chance, he began preparing for the eventual transfer of power with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his military campaigns. His eldest son, Amenhotep II, was gradually given increasing responsibility for governing the empire, allowing him to gain experience while still benefiting from his father's guidance. This careful preparation for succession reflected Thutmose III's understanding that the stability of the empire depended not merely on individual leadership but on the institutional framework that supported the monarchy. The administrative systems, military organization, and cultural traditions that he had developed during his reign needed to be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The pharaoh's legacy extended beyond political and administrative matters to encompass his personal relationship with the gods. The religious texts that he commissioned during his mature years reflected a deepening spiritual understanding that transcended the ceremonial aspects of royal religious duty. These texts, preserved in the royal archives and later copied for use in temples throughout the empire, revealed a ruler who had achieved a profound understanding of his role as the earthly representative of divine authority. The prayers and hymns attributed to Thutmose III during this period combined traditional Egyptian religious formulas with personal reflections on the nature of divine kingship. They spoke of the pharaoh's responsibility to maintain cosmic order, but they also acknowledged the personal burden that came with such awesome responsibility. The texts revealed a man who had achieved greatness but who remained humble before the divine forces that had made his achievements possible as his reign entered its final phase. Thutmose III could look back on achievements that surpassed those of any pharaoh before him. The empire he had built was not merely a political entity held together by military force, it was a civilization that had achieved a synthesis of cultures, ideas, and traditions that enriched the lives of millions of people. The peace and prosperity that characterized his later years were not merely the absence of conflict, but the positive achievement of a society that had learned to harness the energy of diversity for the benefit of all. The pharaoh's final years were marked by a serenity that came from the knowledge that his life's work was complete. The monuments he had built would stand for millennia, testament to the glory of his reign. The administrative systems he had established would continue to govern the empire long after his death. The cultural achievements sponsored by his patronage would inspire future generations of artists, scholars, and thinkers. Yet perhaps the greatest achievement of Thutmose III's mature years was the transformation of his own character. The impetuous young warrior who had once measured success solely in terms of military victory had become a wise ruler who understood that true greatness lay in the capacity to create lasting institutions and cultural achievements. The pharaoh, who had once sought to conquer the world, had learned instead to govern it with wisdom, justice, and compassion in the quiet evenings of his final years. As Thutmose III walked through the gardens of his palace and contemplated the setting sun, he could reflect on a life that had achieved everything that mortal ambition could desire. Yet his thoughts turned not to his own achievements, but to the future of the empire he had built and the people he had served. The greatest pharaoh of his age had become something even more remarkably wise and humble, servant of the divine order that governed the universe. The transformation was complete. The young man who had once stood uncertain in the shadow of Hatshepsut had become the master of the known world. Yet his greatest victory was not over any foreign enemy, but over the limitations of his own nature. Thutmose III had learned that true kingship was not about the power to command, but about the wisdom to serve. Not about the glory of conquest, but about the responsibility of stewardship. In achieving this understanding, he had become not merely a great pharaoh, but a great human being, worthy of the divine mandate he had received and the eternal legacy he would leave behind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the temple courtyards as Thutmose III walked slowly among the columns he had raised to honor the gods. His steps, once quick and decisive as a young conqueror, now carried the measured pace of a man who had learned that true power lay not in the speed of movement, but in the wisdom of knowing when to move at all. The scribe who accompanied him struggled to keep pace with his thoughts rather than his feet, for the Pharaoh's mind remained as sharp as the bronze blade he had wielded in his youth, though his body bore the accumulated weight of 50 years upon the throne. In these twilight years of his reign, Thutmose III had become something more than a conqueror, more than a builder, more than a pharaoh. He had become the living embodiment of Egypt's golden age, a man whose very presence seemed to radiate the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had mastered the art of endurance. His courtiers watched him with a mixture of reverence and melancholy, for they knew they were witnessing the end of an era that would never come again. The great Pharaoh spent his final years not in the pursuit of new conquests, but in the careful cultivation of the legacy he would leave behind. His empire stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, a realm so vast that its very existence seemed to defy the natural order of things. Yet Thutmose III understood that empires built by the sword must be preserved by wisdom, and so he turned his attention to the delicate art of succession. His son, Amenhotep II, had been carefully groomed for the throne, trained in the arts of war and peace, diplomacy and administration. But Thutmose III knew that no amount of training could prepare a young man for the weight of ruling the greatest empire the world had ever known. The old pharaoh spent countless hours with his heir, not lecturing him about the mechanics of power, but sharing the deeper truths that could only be learned through experience. A pharaoh must be like the Nile, he would tell his son as they walked through the palace gardens in the early morning hours. Sometimes fierce and overwhelming, sometimes gentle and nurturing, but always essential to the life of the land. The people do not need to love you, but they must trust that you will always flow in the direction that serves Egypt's greatness. These conversations between father and son became the foundation of a new tradition in Egyptian royal education. Previous pharaohs had often left their successors to learn through trial and error, but Thutmose III understood that the empire he had built was too complex and too precious to be left to chance. He created a systematic approach to royal instruction, combining practical experience with philosophical reflection, military training with diplomatic finesse. Amenhotep II was gradually given greater responsibilities, first in the administration of specific provinces, then in the management of military campaigns against restless vassal states. Under his father's watchful eye, he learned to balance the competing demands of different regions, to understand the subtle art of knowing when to show strength and when to demonstrate mercy. The young prince proved himself capable, though he lacked his father's natural genius for strategy and his intuitive understanding of human nature. As the years passed, Thutmose III began to withdraw from the day-to-day business of governing, content to serve as an advisor and guardian of the realm's deeper traditions. He spent increasing amounts of time in the temple complexes, not out of religious devotion alone, but because he understood that the pharaoh's relationship with the divine was the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization. His presence at religious ceremonies became a form of teaching, demonstrating to his people that even the greatest of pharaohs remained humble before the gods. The foreign dignitaries who still came to pay tribute to Egypt found themselves in the presence of a man who had transcended the usual categories of rulership. Thutmose III received them with the same careful attention he had always paid to diplomatic protocol, But there was something different in his demeanor now. He seemed to be listening not just to their words, but to the deeper currents of history that flowed beneath the surface of political negotiations. The Mitannian ambassador, representing a kingdom that had once been Egypt's greatest rival, spoke of the deep respect his people had developed for the pharaoh's wisdom and restraint. "Your Majesty," he said during a formal audience, "my king has instructed me to convey his gratitude for your understanding of the delicate balance that must exist between great powers. You could have crushed us completely, yet you chose to make us partners in prosperity instead." Thutmose III smiled at these words, though his expression carried a hint of sadness. "Young kingdoms rise and fall like the flooding of the Nile," he replied, "but civilizations endure only when they learn to create rather than merely destroy. Egypt's greatness lies not in the number of enemies we have defeated, but in the number of friends we have made from former enemies." In his final years, Thutmose III devoted himself to completing the architectural projects that would serve as his most enduring monuments. The great temple complex at Karnak, already magnificent beyond description, received his final touches. He supervised the installation of the pair of red granite obelisks that would stand as eternal sentinels before the temple entrance, their hieroglyphic inscriptions telling the story of his reign in language that would outlast the empire itself. The pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a project that had occupied skilled craftsmen for decades, neared completion. Unlike many of his predecessors, who had focused primarily on the grandeur of their burial chambers, Thutmose III insisted that his tomb serve as a repository of knowledge as well as a resting place for his mortal remains. The walls were decorated not only with traditional scenes of the afterlife journey, but with detailed maps of the known world, astronomical calculations, and excerpts from the wisdom literature that had guided his reign. His mortuary temple, rising from the west bank of the Nile like a vision of divine architecture, incorporated innovative design elements that would influence Egyptian builders for centuries to come. The complex included not just the traditional elements of royal mortuary architecture, but also libraries, schools, and workshops where the finest craftsmen of the empire could train their successors in the arts that had made Egyptian civilization the envy of the world. The aging pharaoh took particular pleasure in his botanical gardens, where he had cultivated plants and trees brought from every corner of his empire. The gardens served both as a symbol of Egypt's reach and as a practical demonstration of the kingdom's commitment to learning and growth. Scholars from across the Mediterranean world came to study the exotic species that flourished in the Egyptian climate, adding to the growing body of knowledge that would eventually find its way into the great library of Alexandria. The old pharaoh often walked among these gardens in the early morning hours, when the air was cool and the light had that particular quality that made every leaf and flower seem to glow with inner fire. He would pause before certain plants, remembering the campaigns that had brought them to Egypt, the negotiations that had secured their safe passage, the careful cultivation that had helped them adapt to their new home. Each plant was a small victory, a testament to the power of patience and understanding over brute force. His architects and engineers, men who had worked with him for decades, noticed that the pharaoh's approach to construction had evolved over the years. Where once he had demanded speed and efficiency above all else, now he emphasized craftsmanship and permanence. "Build for eternity," he would tell them, "not for the applause of the current generation. The stones we place today will bear witness to our civilization long after our names are forgotten." The workshops attached to his mortuary temple became centers of innovation in their own right. master craftsmen developed new techniques for working with stone, metal, and wood, creating objects of unprecedented beauty and durability. The pharaoh himself often visited these workshops, not as an inspector or supervisor, but as a student eager to learn from the masters of their crafts. His questions were always thoughtful, his suggestions always practical, his appreciation for fine work always genuine. Foreign artisans, drawn by the reputation of Egyptian craftsmanship and the pharaoh's generous patronage, came to work in these royal workshops. They brought with them techniques and traditions from distant lands, creating a cross-pollination of ideas that enriched Egyptian art and architecture. Thutmose III encouraged this exchange, understanding that true greatness came not from isolation, but from the ability to learn and adapt. As the 53rd year of his reign drew to a close, those closest to Thutmose III began to notice subtle changes in the great pharaoh's behavior. He tired more easily during long audiences, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. He spent more time in quiet contemplation, often sitting for hours in his private chambers, gazing out over the Nile and watching the eternal dance of felucas and barges that kept the lifeblood of Egypt flowing. His physicians, the finest medical minds in the ancient world, attended him with increasing frequency. They found no specific ailment, no particular weakness that could be treated with their extensive knowledge of herbs and surgical techniques. The pharaoh was simply aging, his body gradually yielding to the inevitable passage of time that not even the gods could halt. He accepted this reality with the same philosophical calm that had characterized his approach to all of life's challenges. "I have lived 3 lives," he told his closest friend and advisor, a man who had served him faithfully for 4 decades. The first as a young prince learning to be a king, the second as a warrior building an empire, the third as an old man, trying to understand what it all means. I am content with all 3, though I think the third has been the most rewarding. His final year was marked by a series of ceremonial events that served both to celebrate his achievements and to prepare the kingdom for the transition to come. The Festival of Opet, always the most magnificent celebration in the Egyptian calendar, took on special significance as what many suspected would be the pharaoh's last public appearance at the ceremony. He performed the ancient rituals with the same dignity and reverence that had characterized his entire reign, but observers noted that he seemed to be participating in something that transcended the immediate moment. Representatives from every corner of the empire came to pay their respects, bringing gifts that reflected the incredible diversity of the realm Thutmose III had created. Nubians brought gold and ivory, Asiatics offered precious stones and exotic animals, Mediterranean peoples presented fine textiles and works of art. The pharaoh received each delegation with the same courtesy and attention he had always shown, but there was a quality of farewell in his manner that moved even the most hardened diplomats to tears. His final months were spent in quiet preparation for the journey that all mortals must eventually undertake. He worked closely with the priests to ensure that all the proper rituals and ceremonies would be performed, that his tomb was properly prepared, that the transition of power would proceed smoothly. But he also spent time on more personal matters, dictating letters to friends and family members, reviewing the distribution of his personal possessions, and providing final guidance to those who would carry on his work. The great pharaoh died peacefully in his sleep during the 2nd month of the inundation season in the 54th year of his reign. His passing was marked by the kind of quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life. There were no dramatic final words, no grand gestures, no desperate attempts to cling to power. He simply closed his eyes one evening and did not open them again, leaving behind a legacy that would endure for millennia. The news of Thutmose III's death spread throughout the empire with the speed of a wildfire, carried by the efficient communications system he had established during his reign. From the temples of Nubia to the trading posts of the Levant, from the administrative centers of Syria to the mining camps of the eastern desert, the people of Egypt and her territories learned that their great Pharaoh had begun his final journey to the realm of the gods. The period of mourning that followed was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. For 70 days, the prescribed time for royal mummification, the entire empire observed rituals of grief and remembrance. Markets closed, festivals were postponed, and ordinary citizens gathered in temples and public squares to share memories of the Pharaoh who had brought them prosperity and security. For more than half a century, the process of preparing his body for burial became a masterpiece of the embalmer's art. The finest priests and craftsmen in Egypt worked with reverent precision to ensure that every detail of the mummification process met the highest standards. His internal organs were carefully removed and placed in canopic jars carved from the finest alabaster. His body was treated with the most precious resins and oils, and his wrappings were made from linen so fine that it seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The funeral procession that carried Thutmose III to his final resting place in the Valley of the Kings was a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The route from the royal palace to the sacred valley was lined with mourners, their faces painted with the ritual marks of grief, their voices raised in the ancient laments that had accompanied Egyptian pharaohs to their tombs for thousands of years. Amenhotep II, now pharaoh in his own right, led the procession with the dignity and composure his father had taught him, though those who knew him well could see the weight of loss in his eyes. Behind him walked the highest officials of the kingdom, the generals who had served under the great Pharaoh, the priests who had performed the sacred rituals of his reign, and the foreign ambassadors who had come to pay their final respects to a ruler they had learned to respect and admire. The burial ceremony itself was conducted with the solemnity appropriate to such a momentous occasion. The pharaoh's mummy, enclosed in a series of nested sarcophagi, each more magnificent than the last, was placed in the burial chamber that had been prepared with such care during his lifetime. The walls, covered with scenes from the afterlife, journey and inscribed with spells that would protect and guide the deceased pharaoh in his eternal existence, seemed to pulse with sacred power in the flickering light of the torches. The grave goods that accompanied Thutmose III into the afterlife reflected both his personal tastes and the incredible wealth of his empire. Golden jewelry of exquisite craftsmanship, weapons that had been used in his greatest victories, religious texts inscribed on papyrus scrolls, and personal items that had been dear to him in life were arranged around the sarcophagus with careful attention to their ritual significance. As the final seal was placed on the tomb entrance, those present felt they were witnessing not just the end of a life, but the conclusion of an entire era in human history. The age of Thutmose III had been marked by achievements that seemed almost impossible, by a combination of military brilliance, administrative genius, and cultural sophistication that would never be equaled. Now that age was over, and the world would have to learn to live without the presence of its greatest pharaoh. In the years immediately following Thutmose III's death, the true magnitude of his achievements became increasingly apparent. The empire he had built continued to function with remarkable efficiency, a testament to the administrative systems he had put in place and the diplomatic relationships he had carefully cultivated. Trade routes remained open, tribute continued to flow into Egyptian treasuries, and the vassal states that had once been rebellious territories remained loyal to the new pharaoh. Amenhotep II, though capable in his own right, found himself constantly measured against the standard his father had set. This was both a blessing and a burden. The institutions and traditions Thutmose III had established provided a solid foundation for continued success, but they also created expectations that were difficult to meet. The new pharaoh wisely chose to build upon his father's legacy rather than attempting to replace it with something entirely new. The stories of Thutmose III's reign began to take on legendary proportions even during his son's lifetime. Scribes in the House of Life recorded detailed accounts of his military campaigns, his architectural achievements, and his innovations in governance. These texts, copied and recopied by generations of scholars, became the foundation for a historical tradition that would preserve the memory of Egypt's greatest pharaoh for thousands of years. Foreign peoples who had encountered Thutmose III during his lifetime carried their own memories of the great pharaoh back to their homelands. The Assyrian chronicles spoke of him with a mixture of fear and admiration, acknowledging his military genius while lamenting the expansion of Egyptian power into territories they had once considered their own. The Hittite records, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, described him as a worthy adversary whose diplomatic skill had been as formidable as his military prowess. The cultural impact of his reign extended far beyond the borders of Egypt. The artistic techniques developed in his workshops influenced craftsmen throughout the Mediterranean world. The architectural innovations pioneered in his building projects were copied and adapted by builders from Nubia to Mesopotamia. The administrative methods he had perfected became models for efficient governance that would be studied and emulated by rulers for centuries to come. Perhaps most significantly, Thutmose III's approach to empire building, his emphasis on integration rather than exploitation, his preference for willing allies over unwilling subjects, his understanding that true power came from creating prosperity, rather than simply extracting well-established principles that would influence political thought for millennia. Later empires, from the Roman to the Byzantine, would study Egyptian methods of governance and find in them lessons that remained relevant long after the pharaohs themselves had passed into history. The religious innovations of his reign also had lasting impact. His careful balance between traditional Egyptian beliefs and the religious practices of his diverse subjects created a model of tolerance and inclusion that was remarkable for its time. The syncretistic tendencies that emerged during his reign, the blending of Egyptian, Asiatic, and Nubian religious traditions, would eventually contribute to the development of more universal religious concepts that would influence the development of later monotheistic faiths. As the decades passed and Egypt's political power began to wane, the memory of Thutmose III's reign became increasingly precious to the Egyptian people. During times of weakness and foreign domination, they would look back to his era as a golden age when Egypt had been the master of the known world. When the pharaoh's word had been law from the cataracts of the Nile to the shores of the Mediterranean. See the Greek historians who encountered Egypt during the period of Persian rule were particularly fascinated by the accounts of Thutmose III's reign. Herodotus, the father of history, gathered stories about the great pharaoh during his travels in Egypt, though by his time many of the details had become confused with legend. The Greeks, themselves builders of empire, recognized in Thutmose III a kindred spirited ruler who had understood that true greatness lay not in the ability to conquer, but in the wisdom to govern well. For thousands of years, the tomb of Thutmose III lay hidden in the Valley of the Kings, its location known only to the ancient priests and guards who had sealed it so carefully. The shifting sands of time covered the entrance, and the memory of its exact location faded from human consciousness. The great Pharaoh slept in darkness, surrounded by the treasures of his earthly life, waiting for the day when the world would rediscover his story. That day came in the late 19th century, when European archaeologists began systematic excavations in the Valley of the Kings. Victor Loret, a French Egyptologist, was the first to locate the tomb of Thutmose III in 1898. What he found was both disappointing and disappointing, because ancient tomb robbers had long since stripped away most of the portable treasures. Thrilling because the tomb itself remained largely intact, its walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that told the story of the Pharaoh's reign in unprecedented detail. The discovery of the tomb marked the beginning of modern scholarly interest in Thutmose III, as archaeologists and historians worked to decipher the hieroglyphic texts, translate the administrative records, and piece together the fragments of evidence scattered across the ancient world. A picture emerged of a ruler whose achievements had been even greater than the legends suggested. The military records found in various Egyptian temples revealed the scope of his conquests with mathematical precision. 17 campaigns in the Levant, victories over dozens of enemy coalitions, the establishment of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Evidence was overwhelming, but more importantly, the records also revealed the methods by which he had achieved these victories: careful planning, superior logistics, innovative tactics, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Archaeological excavations at sites throughout the former Egyptian empire began to reveal the physical evidence of Thutmose III's reign. Fortresses in Palestine bore inscriptions commemorating his victories. Administrative buildings in Syria contained records of Egyptian tax collection, and temples in Nubia displayed scenes of the pharaoh presenting offerings to the gods. The material culture of his era pottery, metalwork, textiles, and artwork demonstrated the incredible prosperity and cultural sophistication of his reign. Modern scholars have been able to reconstruct not just the chronology of his reign, but also the underlying principles that guided his actions. Computer analysis of ancient texts has revealed patterns in his decision-making that demonstrate a level of strategic thinking that would be impressive even by contemporary standards. His ability to balance military pressure with diplomatic negotiation, to maintain control over vast territories while respecting local customs and traditions, and to build institutions that would outlast his own lifetime, all point to a ruler of extraordinary ability. The study of Thutmose III's reign has also contributed to our understanding of the ancient world more generally. His military innovations influenced warfare for centuries. His administrative systems provided models for efficient governance, and his cultural achievements helped to establish artistic and architectural traditions that would define Egyptian civilization for millennia. Modern historians increasingly recognize him as one of the most important figures of the ancient world, a ruler whose impact extended far beyond the boundaries of his own time and place. Perhaps most remarkably, the more we learn about Thutmose III, the more relevant his example becomes to our own times. In an era of global interconnection and complex international relationships, his approach to building and maintaining an empire through mutual benefit rather than exploitation offers lessons that remain highly applicable. His understanding that true power comes from creating prosperity rather than simply extracting wealth resonates with modern theories of sustainable development and international cooperation. The Pharaoh who ruled Egypt more than 3,000 years ago continues to influence our world today, not through the exercise of direct power, but through the enduring example of what leadership can accomplish when it is guided by wisdom, restraint, and a genuine concern for the welfare of all people. His legacy reminds us that greatness is not measured by the extent of one's dominion, but by the quality of one's character and the positive impact of one's actions on the world. In the end, the story of Thutmose III transcends the boundaries of conventional historical narrative. He was more than a successful military commander, more than an efficient administrator, more than a patron of the arts and sciences. He was the embodiment of an ideal perfect synthesis of power and wisdom, ambition and restraint, strength and compassion that represents the highest aspirations of human civilization. His reign marked the apotheosis of Egyptian civilization, the moment when all the accumulated wisdom and achievement of 3 millennia of pharaonic rule reached its fullest expression. The temples he built, the territories he conquered, the institutions he established, and the cultural innovations he sponsored created a legacy that would endure long after the political power of Egypt had faded into memory. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Thutmose III's legacy is the way it continues to inspire and instruct us today. In our own complex and interconnected world, his example offers timeless lessons about the nature of leadership, the responsibilities of power, and the true meaning of greatness. His story reminds us that the highest form of human achievement is not the accumulation of wealth or the exercise of dominion over others, but the creation of something beautiful, lasting, and beneficial to all humanity. The Pharaoh who once walked the halls of his palace in Thebes, who planned military campaigns in the cool dawn hours, who received tribute from distant kingdoms and offerings from grateful subjects, who supervised the construction of magnificent temples and the creation of exquisite works of art. This man achieved a form of immortality that surpasses even the elaborate burial preparations of his own time. His true monument is not the tomb that holds his mummified remains, but the example he set for all who would seek to leave the world better than they found it. The sands of time have covered the cities he built. The kingdoms he conquered have long since crumbled into dust, and the empire he created has passed away like a dream. But the memory of what he accomplished, the principles he embodied, and the standards he set continue to resonate through the corridors of history. In libraries and museums, in universities and archaeological sites, in the minds of scholars and the imaginations of all who hear his story, Thutmose III lives on as a symbol of human potential realized in its fullest form. As we reflect on his extraordinary life and achievements, we are reminded that true greatness is not a matter of accident or circumstance, but of choice and character. Thutmose III was born into privilege and power, but he chose to use those advantages in service of something greater than himself. He inherited a kingdom, but he chose to transform it into an empire. He possessed the means to indulge his personal desires, but he chose to dedicate his life to the welfare of his people and the glory of his civilization. In the quiet moments of contemplation, when the noise of our own busy lives recedes and we have time to consider the deeper questions of existence, the example of Thutmose III offers both challenge and comfort. It challenges us to examine our own lives and ask whether we are making the most of the opportunities we have been given. It comforts us with the knowledge that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievement when they are guided by wisdom, motivated by noble purposes, and sustained by the knowledge that their actions will outlast their own brief existence. The story of Thutmose III is ultimately the story of what human beings can accomplish when they dare to dream of greatness and have the courage to pursue that dream with unwavering determination. His legacy is not just the record of what one remarkable man achieved in his lifetime, but a testament to the potential that lies within all of us to create something beautiful, lasting, and meaningful in our own brief passage through this world. And so the great Pharaoh sleeps in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, surrounded by the silence of the desert and the weight of centuries. But his spirit lives on in every act of courage, every moment of wisdom, every choice to serve something greater than oneself. In the end, this is the true measure of immortality, not the preservation of the body, but the endurance of the ideals one lived by and the inspiration one provides to future generations. The sun sets over the Nile as it has for countless millennia, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would have been familiar to Thutmose III himself. The river flows on toward the sea, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of ages, the memories of greatness achieved and glory won. And in that eternal flow, in that ceaseless movement of water and light and time, the spirit of Egypt's greatest pharaoh continues its own eternal journey, a reminder that some achievements are too great to be confined by the boundaries of a single lifetime, too meaningful to be diminished by the passage of centuries, too beautiful to be forgotten by the turning of the ages. The story of Thutmose III is ended, but its echoes will resonate through the halls of history as long as human beings remember the name of greatness. In the quietude of night, when the world grows still and the mind turns toward deeper truths, his example stands as a beacon of what we might yet become. We dare to dream as boldly as he dreamed, if we choose to serve as nobly as he served, if we commit ourselves as completely as he committed himself to the eternal task of building something worthy of the human spirit. The Pharaoh is dead. Long live the Pharaoh. His crown has passed to other hands, his throne to other occupants, his earthly power to other wielders. But his true kingdom, the realm of memory, inspiration, and eternal example, remains forever under his rule. A dominion that will never know defeat, never suffer decline, never fade into the obscurity of forgotten ages. In that kingdom, Thutmose III reigns still, and will reign until the last human voice falls silent and the final page of history is written. If these timeless stories have touched your heart and sparked your imagination, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Help us continue bringing the wisdom of the ages to those who seek peace in the quiet hours of night. Share these stories with others who might find comfort in the eternal truths that history offers to the restless spirit. Your support helps. Ensure that the voices of the past will continue to speak to future generations, carrying forward the light of human achievement across the centuries.